Merci à vous donc d'être venus aussi nombreux pour un événement qui est inédit à plus d'un titre. Inédit d'abord parce qu'il s'agit de la première conférence. Dear David, you can take your seat. Il s'agit de la première conférence organisée dans ces murs par l'Observatoire de l'immigration et de la démographie. Pour ceux d'entre vous qui ne connaîtraient pas encore l'OID, l'Observatoire de l'immigration et de la démographie, je vais parler plus lentement peut-être, est un laboratoire d'idées qui a été créé il y a 4 ans maintenant, avec l'ambition d'apporter une vision à la fois rationnelle, réaliste, dépassionnée sur ces sujets omniprésents dans le débat public en France, mais aussi ailleurs, et qui nous apparaissaient trop souvent dans leur traitement public se résumer à un échange de slogans ou d'invectives, et cela au détriment des faits. Depuis son origine, l'Observatoire repose sur 2 piliers fondamentaux. D'une part, une forme de rigueur technique et factuelle à laquelle nous tenons énormément, et d'autre part, l'indépendance de notre démarche, indépendance qui vaut à l'égard de l'État et des grandes administrations compétentes sur ce sujet, avec qui nous échangeons néanmoins régulièrement, et indépendance aussi, et peut-être surtout, à l'égard du champ politique. Ça vaut dans notre démarche qui est intégralement apartisane et qui nous permet de parler dans ces murs et dans d'autres à un vaste panel d'élus et de responsables politiques. J'en profite pour saluer les quelques parlementaires qui sont d'ores et déjà dans la salle, ainsi que leurs équipes, et pour remercier monsieur le député Éric Pauget, qui vous dira un petit mot tout à l'heure. Il est retenu pour l'instant au Salon des maires, mais c'est à lui que nous devons l'organisation de cette conférence dans ses aspects les plus logistiques, donc je tiens vraiment à l'en remercier. Je tiens aussi à saluer nos amis les membres du conseil scientifique, notamment ceux qui sont présents ce soir, Michel Auboin qui prendra la parole tout à l'heure, Xavier Driancourt qui est là quelque part. Il est caché derrière, mais il est bien là, Xavier, qui lui parlera demain au Sénat des sujets d'asile. Et enfin, le président Pierre Brochand, puisque Pierre Brochand nous fait l'honneur de présider le conseil d'administration de l'Observatoire de l'immigration et de la démographie, qui dira quelques mots de conclusion tout à l'heure. Par ailleurs, puisque elle nous a fait le plaisir de sa présence et malgré ses discrétions légendaires, je tiens aussi à saluer Michel Tribala, BCC, qui est juste là. Michel Tribala, dont le courage et la rigueur du travail académique sur nos sujets ont clairement ouvert la voie. Elle l'a fait dans un contexte bien plus difficile que le nôtre, dans un contexte académique, institutionnel, peu favorable à ce genre de démarche. Par beaucoup d'aspects, l'existence de l'OID lui doit beaucoup, donc je tiens à l'assurer à nouveau publiquement de notre amitié et de notre reconnaissance. Merci beaucoup, Michel. L'événement qui nous réunit aujourd'hui est aussi inédit par la qualité exceptionnelle, j'ose le dire, des intervenants présents aujourd'hui à Paris, qui nous viennent des 2 côtés de l'Atlantique, d'Europe et des États-Unis, ainsi que d'Israël. Cette conférence est organisée dans le cadre du réseau international de recherche sur l'immigration, qui est un réseau qui regroupe des laboratoires d'idées indépendants en Europe, aux États-Unis et en Israël, indépendants à l'égard du pouvoir politique, indépendants à l'égard des partis dans leurs pays respectifs, mais aussi indépendants entre eux. Si nous faisons des choses ensemble, c'est évidemment néanmoins que nous avons des points communs, le principal étant d'avoir une approche qu'on pourrait qualifier de réaliste sur les sujets d'immigration, qui ne fait l'économie ni de regarder les avantages, ni les inconvénients, ni les difficultés, ni le court, ni le moyen, ni le long terme. Et c'est ce qui peut peut-être aussi être notre différenciant principal dans le débat expertocratique finalement sur les sujets d'immigration. Et je salue aussi d'ores et déjà les autres intervenants internationaux qui seront là un petit peu plus tard dans ce panel. Carl Williams, ici présent, qui est le directeur des recherches du Center for Policy Studies, qui est l'un des plus influents et des plus établis think tanks en Grande-Bretagne. Carl qui a co-signé au printemps dernier un rapport tout à fait éclairant sur la politique d'immigration britannique, notamment dans le contexte post-Brexit. Il nous en partagera les grandes leçons. Le professeur David Coleman, qui est professeur émérite à l'université d'Oxford, spécialiste des sujets liés à la fois à l'immigration et aux politiques d'intégration des immigrés, qui lui prendra le contrepoint finalement de la focale très économique de cette conférence. Et enfin, le dernier mais non le moindre, Jan van de Beek, qui est juste en face de moi, qui est un économiste néerlandais, auteur d'un rapport remarqué dans toute l'Europe il y a 1 an et demi, publié avec l'Université d'Amsterdam sur le bilan fiscal de l'immigration aux Pays-Bas, un rapport que Yann vient de traduire dans un livre qui rencontre une forte attention publique aux Pays-Bas. Car c'est bien le sujet de la conférence aujourd'hui, l'évaluation économique et fiscale, budgétaire de l'immigration. On est là dans l'un des aspects les plus délicats, par beaucoup d'aspects du débat sur l'immigration. Partout dans nos pays, les mêmes questions se posent. La baisse de la natalité, le vieillissement de la population, la nécessité perçu en tout cas comme tel, de renouveler la population active pour assurer un degré satisfaisant de croissance économique, pour aussi assurer la pérennité de nos finances publiques et notamment des systèmes de redistribution sociale. Et il y a un discours qui est très présent et qui semble nous faire trop souvent l'économie de débat, qui consiste à considérer qu'une politique de recours à une immigration plus nombreuse, toujours plus nombreuse, constituerait la seule voie pour répondre à ces défis démographiques, sans grand regard sur la nature des flux, sans grand regard sur un ensemble d'externalités qui peuvent se poser. Vous l'avez compris, à notre sens, ce discours-là ne donne pas matière à consensus, il mérite d'être discuté, et c'est bien tout l'objet de la conférence d'aujourd'hui. Je vais dès à présent me taire pour laisser la parole à nos premiers panélistes, et je propose qu'on commence par notre ami Marc Krikorian, qui est directeur exécutif du Center for Immigration Studies, qui est l'une des organisations les plus identifiées, les plus établies, les plus influentes aux États-Unis dans le débat sur l'immigration, une des figures de Washington depuis quelques années, voire quelques décennies maintenant. L'idée de ce panel, c'est que nos intervenants vont partager leur approche nationale sur ce sujet. La question de l'immigration, on le sait, a été très présente dans la campagne pour l'élection présidentielle américaine. Je crois que ça rend ça d'autant plus passionnant a priori, et ça va se confirmer. Marc, je vous laisse la parole.
Thank you, Nicolas. I wish we were as influential as you made us sound, but we try. What I'm going to talk about is welfare use by immigrants. In other words, taxpayer-supported funding given to immigrants. And I think the place to start is that the first immigration law ever passed in what is now the United States was on poor immigrants and keeping out immigrants who would need support from the community. In 1645, 15 years after the establishment of Massachusetts Bay Colony, the colony passed a measure prohibiting the entry and settlement of people who were likely to be paupers, essentially living off of government support. Now, remind you, this is part of the British Empire, but one part of the British Empire regulating who can come in. This is not, the United States was not like Australia, where the central government dumped anybody it wanted. There was an enormous amount of autonomy very early on, and literally the first immigration law ever passed. Now, what are we talking about? Almost 400 years ago, was designed specifically to keep out people who would be burdens on the community. The first federal immigration law ever passed was in 1882, really, because immigration before that had been regulated by the states. And that also limited and kept out people deemed who were likely to become public charges. A public charge is, in other words, become someone who's going to live off of government benefits. The problem is that measure, especially in the current immigration wave, which really started only in 1965 when we changed our immigration laws, has never really been applied consistently, and the result has been extensive use of welfare by immigrants. To continue a little bit the historical arc of this, in 1996, the new Republican Congress, Republicans had taken over the Congress for the first time since, for the first time in 40 plus years, a couple of years before, and they passed a major welfare reform law. And part of it was tightening up, making stricter the limitations on welfare. The problem is, the way legislation works, this doesn't really work this way in a parliamentary system as much, but in our system, Congress passes legislation and the executive kind of decides how they're going to implement it. This was the Clinton administration, and they defined someone using enough welfare to become what is referred to as a public charge, only based on the receipt of cash benefits as opposed to other forms of benefits, which I'll explain a little more. And so the Clinton administration tried to make it as easy as possible within the legislation that Congress had passed for immigrants to use welfare. The first Trump administration, through regulation, tried to make it much more difficult for immigrants to use welfare. And they enacted a bureaucratic rule, an administrative rule called the public charge rule, which counted other forms of government benefits than cash, support, food support, housing, medical care, as counting toward the assessment of whether a person was or was not a public charge, someone living off of government support. Obviously, that would have excluded many more people, but it was held up in courts and negated as soon as the Biden administration took over. So why is this a problem? Let me go to the second slide and then I'll come back. This is the degree to which households headed by either a native-born American, a lawful immigrant, whether a citizen or not, but a lawful immigrant, and then an illegal immigrant. And as you can see, illegal immigrants use welfare at the highest rates of any of these three groups. Immigrants in general, a majority of households headed by immigrants use at least one form of federally supported welfare. Now, the number for the native-born is, in my opinion, also alarmingly high, 39%. But for immigrants, it's above 50%. For illegal immigrants, it's 59%. And then the breakdown there is for the various forms of welfare. The first one is cash welfare. Cash is not a major welfare source, really, for anybody. Food support is. We have something colloquially known as food stamps. They used to actually be little coupons you had to tear out. It doesn't work that way anymore, obviously, but they're still called that often colloquially. And almost half of households headed by immigrants are using food support, either food stamps or free school lunches. That's another thing where the government will feed your kids. And this is maybe accepted in a lot of countries as a normal part of school, but for us it's not. And then the next category there is Medicaid, which is our word for the health care support for the poor. And again, very high rate uses of rate, much higher than the native born. And the last one is housing. That's not a significant thing. The federal government has no housing estates. There are local and state governments who do that, but the federal form of housing welfare is basically a subsidy for living in regular housing in regular communities. So it's extraordinarily high. And the third slide is, what's clear here is that legal status is only one of the reasons. It's less important than the level of education. Now, this stands to reason, obviously, but it still matters. If you look on the right side, immigrants, and this is, again, anyone who's foreign born, so this is combining legal and illegal immigrants together. Households headed by immigrants with less than a bachelor's degree, less than a 4-year college degree, 2/3 of them use some form of federal government welfare. Interestingly, if you compare the left-hand bar in these two pairings, you see that even the U.S. born with a bachelor's degree or more, 1/4 of them use some form of welfare, but even there, immigrants with college degrees have a relatively high or higher rate of welfare use than the native born. So let me go back to the first slide, Nicola. The reason this happens and the reason illegal immigrants, even though they are statutorily barred from receiving most welfare programs, the reason the numbers are so high is because households headed by illegal immigrants have large numbers of children, almost all of them born in the United States and therefore automatically U.S. citizens under our law. We still have automatic birthright citizenship, which most countries have gotten rid of. And so what that means is the child is not using the food support. The 4-year-old is not going to the grocery store with the food support card and buying groceries. It's the head of household is an illegal immigrant, and his income is supported because the state is feeding his children, in effect, and providing health care for his children. Because our welfare system, if you conceive of the way it's put together, the goal is to support working families who have children. And that's almost a synonym for immigrants, because almost all households, immigrant households that are collecting welfare also have a worker in them. This is not the case that, now I don't know whether this is true or not in other countries, but the sense that I get, is that in many countries you have families, you'll have an immigrant family head with a whole bunch of children, maybe even a couple of wives, and they're all just living off the government. Nobody's working. In the United States, almost all immigrant-headed households that are receiving welfare are also working. The welfare is a support for them, and they're working and they have kids, and they're actually more likely to have children than native-born households, and illegal immigrant households are more likely than legal immigrant households to have children. So, as I mentioned, in 1996, Congress tried to further limit immigrant access to welfare. In fact, the large 1996 welfare reform bill that was one of the key pieces of legislation that the newly resurgent Republican Congress had passed, projected that nearly half of the savings, the monetary savings, that were supposed to come from that reform would come from limiting immigrant access to welfare. This was one of the major selling points, one of the major reasons it passed, even after being vetoed by President Clinton. It was passed again. He eventually signed it. It was a total failure, at least with regard to immigrants. There were actually measures in the welfare reform bill that were, generally speaking, successful in limiting welfare use, but the ones targeted to immigrants were not successful, because within about 5 years after the passage of the bill, the rate of immigrant welfare use was right where it was before the legislation was passed. And the reason for this is, Nicola, you tell me, give me the hook when I've spoken too much. No, leave it on. Huh? Okay. The reasons I listed here, the bar to welfare use only applied to some programs. The most legal immigrants met the 5-year residency requirement, because the point was to keep recent immigrants off of welfare. Once they were here, most immigrants were already here 5 years, legal immigrants. Some states picked up the slack. In other words, they extended their state-based welfare to people who were disqualified. And most important, as I had mentioned earlier, U.S.-born children are U.S. citizens and therefore are eligible for welfare on the same basis as any other U.S. citizen. So the punchline, as it were, the bottom line is, if you want to restrict immigrant welfare use, you must restrict immigration itself. Once a poor person is admitted to a modern society, he is going to receive significant taxpayer benefits. There is this line among libertarians in the United States, and I don't know if libertarian may mean a different thing here, but these are essentially right-wing anarchists, is the way, the polite way I'll put it. Their response, they support unlimited immigration. Their answer is build a wall around the welfare system, not at the borders of the country. The fact is, if you let people in, they will penetrate, as it were, any wall you put up around the welfare system. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you very much, Mark. That was really insightful, as usual. To stay in the US for a few minutes, pour rester quelques instants aux États-Unis, nous allons maintenant laisser la parole à Eric Rouark, qui est directeur des recherches de Numbers USA, une autre organisation bien établie dans le débat sur l'immigration aux États-Unis et qui est aussi très influente. Marc a eu l'occasion de traiter des questions économiques et fiscales d'un point de vue macro, du point de vue de la soutenabilité d'un certain nombre de dispositifs. Eric, je crois, va prendre un angle de vue un petit peu différent, consistant notamment à s'interroger sur l'impact de l'immigration sur le marché du travail, en particulier sur les salaires et en particulier sur la concurrence qui peut se trouver renforcée sur certains postes. Eric, la parole est à vous.
Thank you, Nicolas. And this is great to be here. Thank all of you for having me. So on the PowerPoint, started off by saying there's been a lot of talk in the U.S. since 2016 about experts and how Americans don't understand what's best for us, increasingly because we don't listen to what the experts tell us we should or should not do. This is especially true when it comes to voting. And when it comes to immigration policy, experts tell us, well, not all experts, I should say, most experts. Mark's an expert. He's just not on TV. The experts you see on TV tell us that immigration, even open borders, is in our best interest as Americans. And they would tell us the evidence shows that Americans don't compete with immigrant workers. But that's not true. Of course Americans compete with immigrant workers. And what they point to is something called complementarity theory, which has been the prevailing argument put forth by the expert for many years. And that argument is starting to fade away from the public discourse, but is yet to be formally rejected, because if experts were to reject this theory, that would mean that they would have to admit that what they've been telling us for decades has been wrong. And those who are defending the status quo and even calling for increases in immigration don't admit or can admit that there are trade-offs to immigration, that there's winners and there's losers. For them, the only problem with immigration is there's not more of it. So there is some truth to complementarity, but it's generally true in only exceptional circumstances. We can go to the next one. So there's lots of charts I could have used. I just find this one really interesting, and it shows the real and nominal value of the minimum wage in the United States from 1938, when it was established, until 2024. And what stands out to me is that in 1970, the nominal, the adjusted for inflation real wage was $13.05, which is per hour. Yes, it's the hourly minimum wage. So that's 80% higher than what we see in 2024. And the federal minimum wage is important, I think, because it sets a baseline for what we would say are non-supervisory hourly workers. And a lot of employers who hire immigrants, particularly if they're hiring guest workers or illegal immigrants, will say, hey, we pay a lot higher than the minimum wage, as if that means they're paying a fair wage or a prevailing wage for that occupation. And more importantly, the minimum wage sets the pay scale for entry-level employees. And it hasn't been increased, as you can see, since 2009. And these entry-level jobs, they offer opportunities particularly to younger workers, but also to the less educated, whether young or old. And the fact that these jobs aren't paying very well is a disincentive for American workers to take these jobs. $7.25 an hour is not a living wage in the United States. And I'm not here to argue that it should be, but I do think that it's very important for us to look at this and to acknowledge the federal government's position when it comes to helping working Americans. And also when it comes to the debate about the so-called free market. So the relatively low minimum wage is why some states are raising their own minimum wage. In Maryland, which is Victor's favorite place in the United States, it's $15 an hour. And there's a lot of rhetoric, at least among the Democrats, for raising it to $15 an hour at the federal level. But the Democrats have, for many years, have also supported bringing in basically unlimited number of foreign workers to compete with American workers, oftentimes working under the table, where they're probably earning more than the federal wage, but employers who hire them don't have to pay certain payroll taxes that they would if they hired an authorized worker. So here we see inflation versus the rate of wage growth. And this is just for the year preceding the recent election. And if we see where the red lines are, that's where inflation, the rate of inflation growth was outpacing the rate of wage growth. And the two issues for voters in the 2024 presidential election were the economy and immigration. And these are two issues which are inextricably tied together. Now, there are multiple reasons why inflation took off under the Biden administration, but with prices rising rapidly, particularly for housing and for food and for daily necessities, and when Americans were experiencing that reality, while also watching millions of illegal immigrants come into the United States and the federal government spending billions of dollars to facilitate this entry, but also to provide benefits to these illegal immigrants, many of whom were also entering the labor force, it's not very difficult to understand why Trump won a second term. Thank you. So we combine that with the decline in employment for Americans. And this is also the year before the November 2024 election. So you can go back and look at other time periods. I think the height of this, or the depth of it, if you will, was at one point there were job gains for 1.3 million foreign-born, and job losses, this is total losses, for American native-born workers, which were at 1.3 million. And so yes, the Biden administration, in their words, created a lot of jobs, but almost all of these jobs were going to foreign-born workers. All right, thank you. So yes, there are jobs that Americans are reluctant to do, increasingly reluctant to do, because wages and job conditions are unattractive to them. But if we look at the BLS, which is the Bureau of Labor Statistics data, there are only 6 jobs out of 474 occupational classifications which are majority immigrant. And in those 6, and this is 1% of the labor force, these 6 jobs. And in these 6 jobs, Americans are doing 40%, or 40% of the workers in those occupations. So America does not need to import large numbers of immigrant workers. So the shift I talked to earlier in the rhetoric about why we need more immigration is changing. And it's no longer immigrants complement Americans, it's that they're doing jobs Americans are doing, which is great because they're driving down wages, which is keeping consumer prices lower than they would have been if we hadn't had an influx of immigrant workers. And I have a video which is next, and I realized it just 5 minutes ago that it's in English. So, would it play? Well, I don't know if you want to. If everyone would speak English like normal people, that would be much more efficient for the economy.
Let's give it a try.
The second piece is the immigration, right? The illegal immigrants are working. And this has been a real windfall for a lot of businesses that can employ these people in low-skilled labor. And I think if we hadn't had the influx of all these immigrants coming in who are willing to work, and there are plenty of them, but way below market wages, you would have probably seen more layoffs in some of these lower end, or they sure as heck would have been hiring and growing their businesses. So that's been a supply side positive. Like of all the bad things about letting illegal immigrants in and not processing them, the one positive is that it's added to the labor force at the low end in a way that has actually helped the economy. And it's really hard to measure, but we see the data. They don't distinguish between legal and illegal, but you see that foreign-born people are making a much bigger part of the labor force, and it's really surged in the last 3 or 4 years, and it has to be the migrants coming over.
So the takeaway from there is that immigrants, and he said it doesn't matter whether they're legal or illegal, but he mentioned a whole lot of them were coming in illegally over the past 3 or 4 years, are willing to work for way below market value. He is the chief investment officer for Morgan Stanley. He thinks this is great. A lot of American workers don't think this is great. And they voted for someone who has promised to stop the inflow and to raise their wages. And I think that the argument that we're seeing now is better for us because at least they're being honest by saying this was the objective all along. We didn't import lots of workers to boost American wages. We brought them in because they're willing to work for way below market value.
The second piece is,
It's not fair. This, right. Right, this one. So this is another type of expert, one who will, and the rarest of all, is one who will admit that he has made a mistake. And Sir Angus Deaton is a Nobel laureate. He's 79 at this point in his life. He's looking back over his career, at his work over his career, and what he's understood is that he got it wrong, at least in how it affected workers overall. He's from the UK. And so what he's saying is there's more to life than increasing the GDP, or at least there is for those who are in the labor force who are working to increase that GDP or competing with others who are coming in to make the economy larger. And this is something that is very rare, not only saying I got it wrong, but saying it publicly. And we've seen Paul Collier is another economist in the UK who comes to mind. He struggles with this between a more liberal, in the broader sense, open immigration system and the impact that it has on the workers in the receiving country. In our country, Charles Murray would be someone we would talk about, who wrote a very controversial book, The Bell Curve, who later on in life, decades later, said, I've come to realize that working class people do have inherent dignity, and we should respect that. And one of the ways we should do that is to decrease immigration in order to raise their wages. And so this is really going back to the root of economic study, what it means in the ancient term, which is how everyday people live their everyday lives. We understand what immigration does. Working Americans certainly understand how it affects them. And they don't need experts coming up with metrics to tell them how wrong they are about what they're experiencing in their everyday lives. And this group says, it was in our foundational statement, that every sovereign nation has the right to control immigration to our country, whether the experts like it or not. Thank you.
Il aurait été dommage de ne pas utiliser ce morceau de langue française. Merci beaucoup, Eric. Je vais maintenant passer la parole à Jonathan Jakubovic, qui est le directeur de l'Israeli Immigration Policy Center, donc un laboratoire d'idées israélien, qui travaille également sur ces sujets migratoires. Jonathan a également travaillé au ministère de l'Intérieur d'Israël sur ces questions, et il va nous partager la perspective forcément singulière de son pays sur ce thème. Jonathan, c'est à vous.
Thank you, Nicolas. Thank you for being here. If I have to take, as I'll explain, Israel's immigration policy is probably very different than most other countries, but if I had to take a lesson that could be relevant in my eyes to all countries, I think then we should say it's not about immigration, yes or no, it's more about who we take in, how many we take in, and no more than necessary. Just to give a very short background on Israel's immigration policy, Israel's legal immigration policy is based mostly on the law of return, which says that Jewish people and their children and grandchildren and spouses can come to Israel. This is almost a constitutional law in Israel. And legally there's also family reunification, which means that also non-Jewish citizens can bring spouses. So if we're talking about the Arab minority, then there's a substantial immigration through family reunification. But the majority of legal immigration to Israel is through the law of return. So Israel doesn't really get to choose what migrants it takes in because of that semi-constitutional law. So we get all sorts of immigrants. If we're talking about one of the biggest groups are immigrants that came from the former Soviet Union. I would even say that that's one of the largest and per capita and most successful in absorption immigrations in the 20th century. Beginning of the 90s, Israel absorbed over 700,000 immigrants in a decade out of a population of around 4 million people, 4.5 million people. So that's a very large influx compared to capita. But we have to say that we were very lucky that a large portion of these immigrants who came in were highly educated, even higher educated than the Israeli-born population. On the other hand, we have also immigration from a country like Ethiopia, which is a third world country, and in beginning stages, both populations, even the influx from the former Soviet Union, Israel had to invest a lot of financial because Israel doesn't only give them citizenship automatically, but they also give them support with housing, active support, higher than they get. They not only get access to the regular welfare programs that all citizens get, but they get like extra investment and stipend. And the absorption of the Jews from Ethiopia was a little more difficult, and we had to put in more money. But I'll have to say that while Israel has is one of the countries with the highest percentage of foreign-born citizens or parents who were foreign-born, we used to be the highest. Luxembourg just passed us, and a lot of European countries are speeding ahead also, but we're still the second highest. And definitely if we're talking about foreign parents who are foreign-born, because the majority of immigrants coming into European countries are newcomers in the past decade or so, and the pace is going higher. So even though, so we're talking about a substantial number, and even today the inflow of immigration is pretty high per capita. So even though we're talking about such a high percentage of immigrants, on many in many aspects, it's actually considered a very successful integration. The average immigrants have a higher education than Israeli-born, so they don't. Maybe they take higher paying jobs, but not less paying jobs. We also see that over the time, immigrants say that they're that they feel very connected to Israel, that they're happy to be Israeli. We see among second-generation migrants that their SAT scores are a little higher than Israelis, and also the average employment rate among immigrants is a little higher than Israeli-born people, citizens. And not only that, if we're talking about the immigrants from former Soviet Union, then also we see that they say that they have after 2 decades, they have Israeli friends. They also serve in the army at the same rate as Israeli residents, even though it's compulsory. That's still it's a lot. Whoever doesn't want to do it can get out. So the fact that they serve at the same percentage as Israeli-born shows a very high and successful integration. So if we look at Israel's legal permanent immigration, can say that everyone pretty much agrees that although the initial investment demands a very high investment, over time the integration is very successful, and they support the economy, and it brought a very high development to Israel. It's one of the things that moved Israel's economy fast forward very quickly. I would argue that the main reason, and since also we don't have Israel doesn't choose its migrants, but this is also not something that any other country can do. One of the main reasons that it's been successful is because of the common ethos. People come in, and very big difference is Israel has immigration from over 100 different countries, and there's a very big cultural difference between Jews and their relatives or from Russia or from Ethiopia. But because of the common ethos, then I think Israel has been able to develop a combined shared feeling. There's statistics to point out that people who aren't able to integrate into that common ethos have a harder time. As I said, the law of return says that Jews, but also their relatives, if we're talking about now, a large portion of the people coming are not, they're not religious Jews, and not even ethnically Jewish, because they can have just one grandfather who's Jewish. So we do see that people who are further away from their Jewish identity is people who come mostly because they had one grandfather. So sometimes we see that we see emigration among some of these populations, and also a little bit more crime and people who get out of school at younger age. So we do see that people who don't integrate into this common ethos have a harder time, and the economic implications are more difficult and costly. I will also say that even people who don't come over through the law of return, when we're talking about small numbers, and I'll get to that in a minute, then people at small numbers we can there has been some good absorption and integration. For example, Israel's one of Israel's famous songs in the past few years is called Comme ci, comme ça. It's by an immigrant who was born in Israel to parents from Togo, and he's very much loved by Israelis who sing his song. So we do see that small numbers of migrant workers who have children and who eventually receive citizenship in Israel are able to be absorbed. But when we do see that migrants who came in larger numbers at the beginning, around 2005 forward regularly, mainly migrants from the Horn of Africa in mass numbers. So we see among the second generation many troubles that we can see also in Europe. Much higher among their children, much higher crime rate, and a lot of social. Israel has to invest a lot of social investment, even though they don't officially have legal citizenship, because in Israel it's people born. Just give me also a heads up on how much time I have. 1 minute. Okay, I will also say that. Interestingly, even though Israel has so many foreign-born citizens, it has one of the highest rates per capita of foreign workers. And the reason is because the integration has been so good, Israel still needs a lot of labor hands to do the harder jobs that Israelis don't want to do, because we have almost full employment. And what's important here to see is that Israel, when we're talking about foreign workers, while they have the protection of working laws, minimum wage, and all those rights, they don't get any social benefits. Israel also has the strictest laws in the OECD about bringing relatives of these foreign workers. They usually come for 4 years, no more. Israel enacted a deposit law which says that their pension goes into a government-run fund because they're only here for a few years. That they can receive only once they leave, and if they don't leave on time, then they can be fined out of that deposit. And we see that has been working quite well. So if I take it into to wrap it up, when we're talking about migrants that are coming and have a common ethos to the local community, Israel's absorption rate is very, very high. But Israel complements that with temporary foreign workers, as opposed to some European countries that let people come in as foreign workers and stay, and that has been working quite well. I will say just then that it's not perfect, and in the past 2 decades, more and more are starting to stay, and it's a little working. I'd even say that while many countries are moving more to the conservative side on immigration, Israel is actually going the other direction and opening up to different kinds of immigration, which is what we're working on. So I would say that if there's anything to learn, and that's what we say to the Israeli population also, is that it really depends who you're bringing in, how many, and how fast you can integrate them. And if not, foreign workers is also a win-win situation where they can come, work for a few years, and go back to their countries. And in Israel, it has worked for the last almost 40 years quite well. And I think other countries can learn from that too.
Merci beaucoup Yonatan. Dernier intervenant du panel, Victor, dont je me charge de projeter le support dans les secondes qui viennent. Victor, vous pouvez commencer et je mets en route.
Okay. So even if we can see now,
Yep.
still have my PowerPoint.
Yep.
So actually I was preparing for at least 30 minutes presentation, but Nicola threatened me that my... Okay, now. So actually, Nicola threatened me that I couldn't taste the French wines after the session, so I would like to keep my presentation in 10 minutes. You know, Hungary is a little bit different perspectives and position in the case of immigration and the aforementioned countries from the United States to Israel, because Hungary is not, historically is not an immigration country. And it started to change only in the recent years, even if Hungary experienced a big number of, let's say, refugees or other people decades ago or 100 years ago. Now the situation is very, very different. How Hungarian people meet with immigration in the last decade? After the regime change, hundreds of thousands of Hungarian people arrived from the Hungarian diaspora, from Romania, Serbia, or Slovakia. But the integration, both culturally and economically, it was a relatively easy process, thanks to because they were Hungarian. But what changed in the last years is that Hungary is facing both employment challenges and, of course, the increasing number of irregular migration. What happened in the last, let's see, 14 years was a complex answer from the government, which is very, very unique because governments regularly don't follow complex solutions or methods, but at this time, at least, it happens. And to find answer for the demographic, economic, and other challenges of Hungary, the government followed a relatively deep transformation of the society. And instead of importing migrants to the economy, according to mainstream scholars that we could hear previously, they started to find alternative solutions for the increasing employment and to activate the human resources of the country. The problem was, in general, that thanks to the socialist heritage, the Hungarian state had a very generous welfare system, which led to a high dependency. So by 2010, you know, the Hungarian population was 10 million in 2010, and only 3.5 million people worked in the country. So actually, 3.5 million people were responsible for the other 6.5 million people, and definitely it was an unsustainable system which needed some revision. It's very important to underline, ladies and gentlemen, it's never easy, you know. So it was definitely a carrot and stick policy. So, and what was the parts of the carrot and what was the stick in the system? So there was a huge efforts from the government to create new jobs. Sometimes it's strong state subsidiary for the different companies. The other tool was, you know, the socialist labor market was relatively strict and unflexible. Okay, so the government opened the position for flexible time job and part-time job, which was more or less unknown previously for the society. But what was the part of the stick was a more conditional aid policy for and a social welfare policy for the different people. For example, people could and can get unemployment benefits and other social benefits only if their children has a good school attendance. Because, you know, now there is the second or third generation people who lose their job after the collapse of socialism. I forgot to mention that among these 10 million people, 1 million jobs ceased to exist after the collapse of socialism. You know, during socialism, it was a very special system, and there was full employment officially, which means that after when Hungary returned to capitalism, you know, it revealed, of course, there's no need for so many labor force. So actually 1 million jobs ceased to exist, and only 500,000 of new jobs were created. So hundreds of thousands of people fell out from the labor market. And I think it's a key term, and it was partly mentioned also, Mark and Eric, that the problem was not unemployment in Hungary. The problem was that almost 1 million people fell out from the labor market. They left the labor market and they didn't make effort to find any job. So actually the government declared the program of an employment-based society instead of, you know, social benefit-based society. And in the last 14 years, they reached significant results. So the employment raised from 3.5 million to 4.6 million people. So they add 1.1 million people for the labor market in the last 14 years. And, you know, employment rate between age 16 and 64 increased from 57% to 76% is the society. So it was a big proof that not all immigration can solve the problem. And I have to underline that there's only rough estimations, but we can very confidently state that thanks to these programs, the Hungarian government spared tens of billions of euros because they took these 1.1 million people from the social system into the labor market, which means that not only that the government doesn't have to pay social benefits for them, but they became taxpayers for the Hungarian government. So it's very important. The second issue is beside mobilizing the human resources of the country, is to try to implement good family policy. Total fertility rate, because, you know, it's very nice to mobilize human resources of the country, but there will be nobody to be mobilized in the next 50 years if the low fertility rate remains. And in 2011, the fertility rate in Hungary was 1.23. Thanks to family support policy, tax deduction after kids, housing support for young families, they managed to increase it 1.6. It's still far from the 2.1, which is necessary for the maintenance of the population, but much better than 1.23. Even if we see, and we have to confess it, that perhaps this is the maximum and the limits of the family policy, okay? Because the government managed to reach it by 2020, and we don't see any more improvement in the process. So perhaps this is the maximum of this program. Foreign employment, because it's also part of the story, but we have to keep in our mind that for this now the Hungarian population is about 9.7 because of the shrink. We have 100,000 foreign labor in our labor market, so it's very, very minimal, even if the numbers are increasing. Thanks to the economic boom between 2010 and 2020, previously, foreign employees were mainly employed in the high-tech industry with huge added value. But thanks to the huge economic boom because more and more Hungarian is changing mind to whether they are ready to do the 3D jobs, dirty, difficult, dangerous, we can see an increasing number of foreigners who are coming and are employed in these sectors, which also, and we now see some symptoms, what Mark and Eric mentioned in the case of the United States. The foreign employment is still too selective, and in regional dimension it's not too competitive. And there is an interesting phenomenon because Hungary is also the part of the Schengen zone, and it accepted a new regulation for foreign labor force. But actually the case is, and the Hungarian police officers and immigration officers are complaining that we are making the visa procedures actually for German, Austrian, and French companies, because the wages in Hungary is much lower than, of course, in Western Europe. Why sometimes getting the work permit seems much easier. So it's a regular phenomenon that people applying visa for Hungary, they do it, spending 2-3 months in the country and then left. And because the company gets a huge penalty if it loses the foreign labor, they never report it for the authorities. And of course, other countries in the West are happy for the arrivals of or the companies for new people. So it's remain mainly unreported. Irregular immigration, it costs Hungary a lot. So Hungary was the first country which erected a long physical barrier towards in its southern border because it was a Schengen border. So it was not just the idea of the government to protect the border, it's compulsory and it's a commitment according to the Schengen Codex and the Lisbon Treaty. It costed Hungary for 2 billion euros, just the fence, not to mention the human manpower and other capacities which are permanently in the Serbian-Hungarian border. And actually the protection of the border is still there, even if the number of arrivals dropped. 2 years ago, it was more than 270,000 people who tried to cross the border. Now it declined to some tens of thousands because of the close Serbian-Hungarian police cooperation. But we can experience that there are new routes in the Western Balkan from Serbia to Bosnia-Herzegovina, Croatia, and Slovenia, and across Bulgaria, Romania, and to Hungary. The other important part of the cost of irregular migration is the Ukrainian refugee crisis, which is, of course, a different phenomenon, but it demonstrates also a huge burden for the Hungarian society. There are very different estimations. Officially, there are 60,000 Ukrainian refugees in the country. Unofficially, there are somewhere between 100 and 200,000, so 1 or 2% of the population. It's very hard to determine because we can observe now a commuting of people between Hungary and Ukraine, so they don't apply for official temporary protection because they can't leave the country and come back. If they go back to Ukraine, they lose the social benefits. But it's very visible that many Ukrainians spend 2-3 months in Hungary working officially or unofficially, go back home, checking whether the house, the family is still okay, and then coming back to the country. And according to rough estimation, it's also cost for Hungary annually between 100 and 300 million euros. And I see that Nicola told that I should stop now. So I try to demonstrate the different columns of the Hungarian policy which try to reduce immigration or try to give alternative answers for the demography and labor market challenges of the country. Of course, there's no silver bullet, and it's not possible to solve the case only with family policy or the mobilization of human resources of the country, but it can significantly reduce the necessity of foreign laborers in the country. Thank you very much.
Monsieur Éric Pauget, qui est la puissance invitante, et qui travaille de longue date sur ces questions d'immigration, et qui sera heureux de vous dire quelques mots. Monsieur le député, je vous laisse la parole.
Merci et bonjour à toutes et à tous. Moi, je suis très heureux, en tant que député français, député de la nation française, député des Alpes-Maritimes, de vous accueillir ici. Ah oui, il faut parler moins vite pour le... Je vais essayer. My English is so bad that I will not try to do it. So I will keep on in French. Je vous disais, très heureux de vous accueillir à l'Assemblée nationale. Et je pèse mes mots. Je pense que d'accueillir l'Observatoire de l'immigration et de la démographie, de vous accueillir, monsieur le directeur, ici à l'Assemblée nationale, c'est un symbole important. C'est ce que je voulais déjà dire. Il y a 2 ans en arrière, j'avais accueilli l'association Contribuables Associés qui avait déjà fait une tentative, je dis bien une tentative parce que le sujet est complexe, d'évaluation du coût de l'immigration en France. Et je mesure, pour avoir travaillé avec eux, la difficulté. Et donc, moi, je trouve très bien que sur le fond, vous vous empariez de ce sujet, de l'évaluation économique, financière de l'immigration. C'est bien sur le fond et sur la forme, parce que de s'en emparer de manière sérieuse, scientifique, ça permet des fois de faire tomber des tabous. Ça permet de mettre clairement les sujets sur la table. Et malheureusement, je le dis, dans notre pays, en France, on n'ose pas suffisamment parler d'immigration, alors que c'est un sujet majeur pour nos sociétés, et on n'ose pas non plus aborder de manière lucide et de manière sérieuse le coût de l'immigration. J'ai regardé, bien sûr, avant d'arriver, les documents que vous m'avez fournis et les statistiques qui tournent, comme on dit, les chiffres. La particularité de la France, et vous en débattez, c'est qu'on a une immigration qui est peu qualifiée, une immigration qui est plutôt pauvre, qui a du mal à s'intégrer. Et la vraie difficulté, ma vraie crainte, et je le tire des chiffres que vous m'avez donnés, c'est que la génération qui arrive, issue de cette immigration, est encore plus en difficulté. Et donc ça doit nous interpeller. Et si on ne veut pas qu'un jour, les extrêmes, au sens large, s'emparent des valeurs de la République, on doit faire le travail que vous faites et on doit vous accueillir dans un Parlement et dans des parlements pour aborder de manière sérieuse ces sujets. Moi, j'ai beaucoup travaillé avec l'ambassade du Canada dans ma fonction de parlementaire, notamment il y a 2 ans en arrière quand on préparait le texte Asile-immigration. Je suis allé m'inspirer un petit peu de ce qui se faisait au Canada. Je vois qu'aujourd'hui, le Canada revient un peu en arrière. Mais il y a un point intéressant qui est en lien direct avec le sujet que vous abordez aujourd'hui, c'est que le Canada a bâti son développement sur de l'immigration contrôlée, choisie, maîtrisée. C'est-à-dire que quand vous voulez immigrer au Canada, on vous demande quel est votre niveau de qualification, on vous demande si vous avez les moyens de vous implanter, de vous intégrer, et les Canadiens se posent la question en sens inverse, est-ce que j'ai besoin de telle personne, de telle qualification pour mon économie? Et je trouve que cette démarche-là, pour une grande démocratie qu'est le Canada, un pays qui s'est bâti sur l'immigration, devrait nous inspirer. On ne peut pas transposer le modèle à notre pays, mais en tout cas, on devrait s'en inspirer. Et donc, pour conclure, je ne veux pas être plus long, parce que moi, je veux aussi écouter les débats qui vont avoir lieu avec les différents intervenants de grande qualité. Vous dire que ce que vous faites est extrêmement important. Il faut le renouveler, il faut le démultiplier, il faut communiquer dessus, parce que c'est comme ça que l'on apportera une réponse à nos populations, au peuple de France, sur un sujet qui aujourd'hui traverse la société et qui est majeur. Et quand je dis majeur en France, majeur dans nos pays occidentaux, parce que vous le savez, vous êtes des spécialistes du sujet, si on ne s'accapare pas ces thèmes, la démographie mondiale fait qu'il y aura dans les décennies qui arrivent un bouleversement par rapport à ce qu'on a connu. Et donc, ou bien on anticipe ces bouleversements, ou bien on les accompagne, ou bien on se donne des capacités de répondre, ou alors on le subit. Moi, je fais partie d'une génération de politiques qui n'aime pas subir. Et donc, de vous écouter, d'analyser vos travaux, c'est un moyen de nourrir la réflexion modeste du député que je suis, et derrière, j'espère, de nombreux parlementaires, parce que le but de vos travaux, c'est qu'ils soient publiés et c'est qu'ils soient diffusés. Merci à vous toutes et à vous tous.
Merci infiniment, monsieur le député, pour vos encouragements qui nous touchent beaucoup et pour votre accueil et pour votre engagement de longue date sur ces sujets dont je n'ai aucun besoin de vous convaincre de l'importance. Je vais maintenant céder la parole à Carl Williams, qui nous arrive de Londres. Carl, qui est directeur du Center for Policy Studies, qui est donc l'un des plus importants think tanks britanniques, qui a publié il y a quelques mois un rapport sur la politique d'immigration au Royaume-Uni, dans le contexte particulier de la Grande-Bretagne post-Brexit. Je n'en dis pas plus. Carl, c'est à vous. Just give me a sign when you want to switch to another slide. I'll be doing it. Sure. Okay. Right.
I'd like to start by saying thank you to the International Network for Immigration Research, and particularly to Nicola and the OID for hosting this conference. I think everyone in here is from a country that is caught up in one facet or another of the same global crisis in legal and illegal migration. I think this is a fantastic opportunity to learn from what we're doing in different countries and to some extent cooperate on resolving these problems. Now, I'm mostly going to focus on legal rather than illegal migration today, and the fiscal and economic impacts in the UK. Firstly, I'm going to talk a bit about the...
Ok. Ok. Est-ce que ça va?
Yeah.
Super.
Continue? Great. There we go. So, again, thank you for putting on this conference. I think we're all facing similar problems. A recent OECD report that came out just a few days ago pointed out that net migration to OECD countries in 2022 to 2023 was about 6.5 million people. About 12% of that was to the UK. This has had major ramifications to the politics of the UK, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit, but mainly I want to talk about the data and what we can tell about the fiscal and economic impact of immigration. Secondly, to look at what we can provisionally learn from that, and I'm going to be talking through some of the details from this report. And then if I have the time, I'm going to talk about what might be the next steps for this part of the debate. So the UK policy background, it's both very depressing at the moment for reasons you'll see, and also quite exciting, because there is a sense over the last perhaps 18 months or 2 years that the dial is beginning to shift. That intellectually migration restrictionists are starting to win the debate. This, I think, shows part of the reason why. The absolutely incredible numbers and the sheer scale of this has made people sit and pay attention. 68% of the public now say immigration has been too high over the last decade, compared to just 4% too low, and politicians are catching up. And obviously, in 2016, the UK voted to leave the European Union. A large part of the reason for that was to end freedom of movement and bring down migration. In 2019, the Conservative government, the Conservative Party, was elected on a manifesto that promised overall numbers will come down, and it promised that migration would be high-skilled rather than low-skilled. As we can see, it didn't quite turn out like that. So on the eve of the Brexit referendum in 2016, net migration was running at about 300,000, the highest ever. In 2022, it reached 764,000. That's 3 times the average of 241,000 that it was in the 2010s. I'm not going into the politics of why this happened and why the Conservatives failed to keep their promise. But the mechanics of it, we replaced our previous system with a notionally Australian-style points-based system. In doing so, we calibrated it completely wrong. The salary thresholds were set at a very low rate. We introduced all sorts of loopholes. We made it much easier to bring dependents. And we also delegated a large part of the visa system to the universities, which I'm going to touch on in detail in a bit. The result was probably the most demographically consequential parliament in British history. Net migration of about 2.5 million people. That's population growth of just under 4% in 4.5 years. And the crucial thing here is the changing composition of migration. And one of the things we want to do with this report is move away from immigration, good or bad, that sort of false dichotomy. Is talk about who's coming here, under what conditions, how long for, where from. And the composition of migration has decisively shifted since 2020, when we finally left the EU. Actually, immigration from continental Europe is now net negative. The increase is driven entirely by countries from Africa, Middle East, non-OECD countries. Part of the reason, as I said, why what's going on is now exciting is I see Alf Mehmet in the audience here of Migration Watch UK. For a long time, a lone voice in the wilderness, the one think tank in Westminster that was reliably migration sceptic. I would say the views they've espoused for 20 years are now mainstream. There's only one right-wing think tank who is still pro-open borders. There has been a decisive shift there. And although there's now a Labour government in power, I think if the Conservatives get back in 5 years, they might finally start to take things seriously. And generationally, the younger MPs, the younger researchers, the younger people in politics are much more clued into this. So I think despite the sort of disasters we've seen in the last few years, there is hope here. So I just want to say a word about data before I get up onto talking through some of these graphs. The UK's had a real problem for many years that even just the basics of knowing who's entering and exiting the country, what is the stock of migrants in the country, has been a big unknown. This is because the Blair government abolished exit checks in the late 1990s. Then we relied on what was called the International Passenger Survey. So this is literally people with clipboards in airports trying to calculate the level of migration. It was a system designed for tourism, not migration. Other survey-based systems like the Labour Force Survey famously massively underestimated the number of European migrants in the country. We are finally moving to an administrative-based system, admin-based data, so looking at national insurance numbers, contact with the house service, contacts with different parts of the state. And I think we will be in the point in a year or two time when we actually have really reliable numbers on just who is in the country, at least for legal migration. However, we are still some years away from the really important stuff around, say, migrant earnings, migrant costs to the state, to the taxpayer, around crime stats by nationality or country of birth. And when putting together this report, we had to fight tooth and nail with government departments to try and get data out for them. Freedom of information requests, written parliamentary questions, spoken parliamentary questions. The advantage was that in doing this, the Centre for Policy Studies was working with two MPs who could sort of leverage their influence to try and get this stuff. And one thing we realised is that the British state does hold most of the data you need to do what is the holy grail of migration policy, a sort of life cycle study of the costs of migration in the style of Dr. Van der Beek here, who is hugely admired in policy circles on migration in the UK. So the data is probably there, it's just fragmented, it's in different databases, it hasn't been streamed together, but again, I'm hopeful that in a few years' time we'll be able to reproduce that sort of analysis. So, when looking at this report, we were sort of addressing three sort of common pro-migration talking points. The first is that migration is great for growth. The second is, even if it's not great for growth, it's necessary to offset an aging population and prop up failing public services. Or failing that, it was simply uncontrollable area of globalization. We had to live with it. And if you look at the economic case for migration, the graph here, we see that the area of mass migration has coincided with a historic collapse in GDP per capita growth rates. Underlying this is a collapse in productivity growth, which has averaged just 0.7% since the financial crisis. If economic historians Nick Crafts and Terence Mills have pointed out that this is the lowest sustained period of productivity growth in Britain since the onset of the Industrial Revolution 250 years ago. Now, migration is certainly not the sole or even the biggest cause of this, but it's undoubtedly part of the picture for two main reasons. Firstly, it's been used as an excuse not to address Britain's other problems. We have very high energy costs because of our energy policy. We have a very restrictive planning system. Both of these have negative effects on growth. But because we've been able to import large numbers of low-skilled migrants, we've been able to paper that over for several years and pump up headline GDP numbers whilst not doing much for living standards. I'm talking quite abstract phrase about GDP per capita and so on, but what that means at the end of the day is the wages in people's pockets, the quality of people's life. So there's that sort of, it's allowed politicians to continue to be short-termists and not address the problems. But also, it does distort incentives to invest. There's plenty of economic studies on this, particularly in American context, but I think they apply in Britain too. In particular, liberalisation of free movement with Eastern Europe was a labour market shock. We have seen some industries that not just stalled in productivity growth, but have actually gone backwards. Famously, there's the de-automisation of car washes. So now it's all hand car washes again, as it was 60 years ago, rather than the machine car washes. We see that in the garment industry. So there's a clear problem there. But there's also the broader problem of the dilution of the capital stock. So a migrant, they might bring skills, but they can't bring a mile of road, they can't bring a school, they can't bring a GP surgery, they can't bring an industrial machine tool. So if we're growing the population through migration faster than we're increasing the capital stock, the assets the country has, that is going to be a drag on productivity, on GDP per capita. But I think this is perhaps nowhere, well, actually before I get onto that, I would like to say the next slide, just to back up this thesis. This is the components of growth in Britain over the past 40 years. And as you can see on the light blue, the contribution of labour to growth rates has gone from around 20 to 30% to around 70 or 80%. The contribution of capital has dwindled, and even total factor productivity, so organisation, ideas, processes, creativity, has fallen. So we are becoming an economy that is dependent on ever higher levels of migration. We have backed ourselves into a trap or a feedback loop that is going to be very hard to escape. One of the most impactful places or impactful areas for capital dilution is housing and Britain's housing crisis. So if we look at the next slide, we calculated using sort of the government's own algorithms that over the 10 years from 2013 to 2023, we built almost enough houses to keep pace with population growth from people who are already in the country. So 2.1 million homes, 150,000 short, not too bad. But to meet the demand stemming from migration, we'd have had to build another 1.19 million homes. So the housing deficit that's widened even further over the last decade, 89% of that is down to migration. So again, this is the intersection of migration with some of Britain's other long-running economic problems. And this is particularly concentrated in areas like London and the South East. About 30% of migrants go to that part of the country. So it's felt in some areas much more than others. And if we go on to the next slide and we look at the social housing, and you can see here London in the heat map, that's because 48% of social housing, so publicly owned housing in London, is occupied by people who were not born in the UK. This is some of the most valuable land in the country, and in fact in the world, given London's sort of economic dynamism and its status as a financial hub. It is a huge opportunity cost. This is land that could be occupied by productive migrants or productive British graduates. Of course, the housing crisis then has effects downstream, which then reinforce migration. So fewer young people getting on the housing ladder, families start later, fewer children. Therefore, the calls for, well, we need migrants to expand the workforce and support an ageing population. So again, we see a sort of self-reinforcing feedback loop. And the other chart on here just shows, once you drill down into sort of what groups of migrants are contributing, not contributing, the disparity is very stark. So 74% of Somalis in the UK live in social housing. That's compared to 5% of migrants from New Zealand or Australia. As you might generally expect, Western European countries, Anglosphere countries, economically tend to perform well. Middle East, North Africa, so on, as we see from studies in the Netherlands and Denmark, are more of a drag on growth and on the public finances. So if we move on to the next slide, and this is our attempt to match up two sets of data on earnings by nationality? Yes, by nationality. One from Treasury data that's real time, one from survey-based data. There's a decent correlation. As again, you can see a huge variation in outcome. So if you're a migrant in the UK and you come from Spain, you're going to be earning about 35% more than someone who's come from Bangladesh or Pakistan, but around about 40% less than a migrant who's come from France or Canada, for example. And a lot of this reflects working patterns. So if you're from Middle East, North Africa or Turkey, that migrant is twice as likely to be economically inactive. So not just unemployed, but not even looking for work, as someone who's who was born in the UK. And obviously there's also particularly interesting sort of gender divides there. So amongst women in, say, Bangladeshi communities, there's very high rates of economic inactivity relative to people born in Britain or migrants from other communities. One final point to make here is sort of interesting stat. A migrant from Canada or Singapore or Australia will be paying between 4 and 9 times as much in income tax as a migrant from Somalia or Pakistan. I should point out this isn't all legal migration, because some of the migrants here will be people who have come in as asylum seekers and been granted asylum. Nevertheless, the general trend is quite clear. And then next, final graph just on migrant earnings. So here, the Home Office, again, didn't want to give us data on what salaries people were on when they were offered work visas to come to the UK. So we had to come up with a proxy for that, which was to take the occupation codes associated with each visa and cross-reference that with the median salary of that occupation from separate data. And basically what this graph shows is that 68% of working visas go to people who are likely on salaries below the UK median salary, so just straight away bringing down the average. Something like 76% are below even the UK mean salary for a full-time worker. So perhaps only a quarter of just the working part of the visa system is contributing above the existing UK average to the well-being of the public finances. So there's a lot of rhetoric about migration being great for growth, great for public finances. And in theory, it could be if we changed the rules and we changed the mix and we just focused on the people at the top of the distribution. But in the fact, at the moment, we have a very lax system which allows in a very broad range of workers. And one of the quirks of the system, I don't have a graph here on it today, unfortunately, is that having opened things up to dependents, we were getting, there are examples of one person coming in on a visa to do social care on a salary threshold of 20,000, bringing with them between 4 and 9 dependents. And these were both children and adults they were looking after. I mean, this is how mad the system got in the last few years. And we have started to close these holes now. But as we saw from the graph earlier on, the overall numbers have been absolutely staggering. One bit I'd like to focus on the next slide is student migration. 2 minutes. Okay, I will zoom through the student migration. I think this is interesting to people because I think it is a dynamic maybe unique to the UK, but I'm not sure. So student migration has gone from 250k to about 400,000 now. This is mostly driven by migrants from countries like Nigeria, Pakistan, and India. They are mostly not coming to study if you look at the incentive systems they face. They are usually doing 1 year's master's courses at low-ranking universities with satellite campuses in London. If we go to the next slide, we can see which universities experience the growth. And they're either universities based in London or they've set up a secondary campus there, all in the last 15 years, incidentally, or virtually all. And with the graduate visa route, this is a visa thing that allows, if you come in as a student and complete your course, you're allowed to stay for 2 years afterwards, find a job, no salary threshold. Actually, because of our low levels of labour market regulation, people come in, they go straight on to wages in the gig economy, typically. We call it a Deliveroo visa. And then after that, they tend to either disappear into the grey economy or they then go and take a low-paid job. In fact, what we've seen in the last year is 5,000 students came to the country and in their first year of studies claimed asylum. So 1 in 80 international students just came here straight away, claimed asylum. This is partly because effectively the award of student visas has been delegated to the universities. So the only constraint on how many students are coming in is how fast the universities can expand. And I wanted to mention this in particular because I think it illustrates how so much of the UK migration policy space is tied up with fixing broader structural issues around higher education, around energy, around our planning system. And it's always a bit chicken and egg. But I think as we get more data and as the costs of migration become more apparent, it is going to provide the incentive both to fix the migration system, but also a lever to fix some of Britain's other problems. And I think I'm running out of time, so I will end there. Okay? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carl. That was absolutely fascinating. C'était vraiment passionnant. Donc, merci beaucoup. Merci beaucoup. Dans son très riche propos, Carl a eu l'occasion de mentionner les travaux du professeur Jan van de Beek, ici présent, et de dire à quel point ils avaient, et ils marquent toujours un moment important dans le débat sur les impacts économiques et budgétaires de l'immigration en Europe. Partant du cas des Pays-Bas, le docteur Jan van de Beek a réussi à dessiner un certain nombre de trajectoires qui s'appliquent à une part importante de nos pays, Yann, je vous laisse la parole. The floor is yours, Yann.
Okay, can you understand me? Okay, so far. Thank you for having me here. I prepared a quite long PowerPoint, so I'll skip a lot of sheets because we are. How many minutes do I have? 15? 15. Okay, yeah. Okay. Well, next slide, please, and then skip this one as well, and the other one as well. We're going to talk about this one for a short while. It's about the report Borderless Welfare State, which I wrote together with 3 other scientists. And the special thing about this report is that it is based on Dutch data, which is extremely detailed. We use data of all, at that time, 17 million inhabitants of the Netherlands. Nowadays, there are 18 million inhabitants. That's how much immigration we have. But in 2016, we had 17 million inhabitants. And among them, 4 million immigrants, 2 million first generation, 2 million second generation. And we had data on all aspects of life. So crime, taxes, welfare dependency, social housing, for example. Some of the things Carl mentioned, we have detailed data about it. So I wrote a report, I translated it into English, and it has been downloaded several tens of thousands of times worldwide. So a lot of people have seen it. Next slide, please. But now I'm on the next mission because this report is a bit technical, and I wrote in Dutch, I started in Dutch, a book, and this book is a Migration Magnet Netherlands, and it's for the general public, because I think what we found in the report should be known to everybody. And I also think we should translate it into several languages, this book. I hope to do this. I'm searching for publishers, here in yellow. Why? I think the Netherlands are a very good example, because the Netherlands is just another Western countries, but because of this detailed data, it can put a lot of pressure on other countries like France, like the UK, that if you have the right data, and we are talking about lack of data in France, in England, in Germany, and many other countries, if we have the right data, we can know things we can't know without the data. And by having one example, in this case the Netherlands, we can put pressure on the political agenda in order to get data for all countries in the West. So that's my next mission. And now I want to show some more technical things about this research. What we see here, the blue line, this one, is the line of the average Dutch native. And what we see is during youth and during the pension age, there are huge costs to the Dutch treasury. And in the meantime, you see benefit there. When people are working, ages between 25 and 65 approximately, people are beneficial to the treasury. They are adding more to the treasury than they are receiving from the treasury. And this is the basis for all our computations. It's a bit complicated. I'm not going to talk about the technical details, but a very simplistic view of the computation is when you look at those 10 gray bars, you see an immigrant who is arriving in the country at 30, leaving at 40, and the first simplistic measure of the net contribution would be just adding up those 10 gray bars. Next slide, please. Something went wrong here. What we see here is 3 lines. The gray line is again for the average Dutch. The blue line is for people from wealthy advanced countries like, let's say, the United States or Japan, who come to work, and the orange line is for asylum seekers. And when you look, for example, between the difference between blue and orange, you see that the orange line never crosses the 0 line. So for all ages, the contribution is negative. And this is just based on a lot of data, detailed data about every aspect of life. Next slide, please. What I came to realize when I looked at those numbers for a prolonged time is that the net cost and benefit of immigrants is actually the best measure of their integration, because this cost and benefit correlates really with everything. It correlates with income, work, health, crime, social housing, whatever. All those points are strongly correlated with the net cost. So integration and net cost. Integration, the best way to look at integration is through the net cost. That's my conviction. A world map, what we see here is the net cost of immigrants and their children by region of origin over the lifetime. And we see here huge differences. Blue and green is positive contributions, which are very high for North America or Japan or France or Scandinavia and some other countries. And red and orange are large negative contributions, which are highest for parts of Africa and the Middle East and some other areas in the world, for example, former Soviet Union. This has much to do with level of education, but also with the immigration motive. Areas where a lot of asylum seekers come from, we see really low, really negative numbers, and areas where a lot of high-skilled labor comes from, we see high contributions. Next, please. The first to look at, of course, is the educational level. We had the educational level of millions of people, so we could compute what is the net contribution over a lifetime for a certain educational level. This reaches, the lowest one is primary education, the highest one is master, so university education. And you see there's a huge difference in the net contribution over a lifetime. What we also see is the blue lines are native Dutch. Native Dutch behaving like immigrants in their immigration and emigration behavior, but for the rest they are native Dutch. Those blue lines are much more positive than the orange and gray lines, which are for Western and non-Western immigrants. And what we see here is loss of human capital. Somehow a lot of immigrants have potential, they have education, but it doesn't materialize in the Netherlands. And this is especially true for the highest levels of education. For example, the master level, you see a gap of a few €100,000 over a lifetime, just diplomas, education, work experience that gets lost. And this is largest with the non-Western immigrants, again, because many of them come as asylum seekers and nobody is waiting for them with a job. So a lot of human capital gets lost there. Then when we look at the educational level and we look at immigration motive, you can break it down. And what we see here is that the educational attainment is highest for study migrants, that's dark blue, and it's lowest for asylum migrants, which is orange. So there's a huge gap in educational level, which explains partly why asylum seekers have such a low net contribution on average. Well, when we sum this all up, we see huge differences between groups in net contribution. Actually, only labor migrants are contributing in a positive way to the treasury. Western study migrants are more or less budget neutral, and all other groups are costing a lot of money. Next, please. Why are asylum seekers so costly for the Dutch welfare state? We are talking about 800,000 per asylum seeker. If you, that can be a family member or the first applicant. If you recalculate it to the first applicant of asylum, it may be 1.3 million over a lifetime, which is a huge amount of money. And actually, I gave the reasons already. A lot of lack of loss of human capital, on average, not a high level of education, and the asylum system is also not working with us. Maybe skip this one, and this one. This is also an interesting one because it shows that people who come to work may differ quite a lot when we look at the region of origin. And we see, especially for Central and Eastern Europe and for Africa and the Middle East, that people who have the immigration motive, labor, are not always contributing in a positive way to the Dutch treasury. So this has to do with low level of income and low level of education. It also has to do with negative self-selection when people are emigrating. So those who are on benefits, for example, have a larger tendency to stay in the Netherlands. So over time, you get a lot of negative self-selection. I call this the reverse welfare magnet. So it's next one. Skip this one. I want to show you. I think we must skip a lot. This is also a point Carl mentioned. I think in other words, but when you have low-skilled labor and in the long run, you become a low-wage country. That's actually what's happening. And my favorite example is the asparagus robot who was invented by a certain company because Polish workers were becoming scarcer and more expensive. So without the Polish workers, probably this robot was invented earlier. Nobody will ever know, but it shows that having a lot of low-skilled immigration is lowering the tendency to innovate. Next one. This is the reversed welfare magnet. You see the number of people on benefits per 100 people working, and you see this differs enormously after 10 years. It differs enormously between regions of origin. So there's an extreme negative self-selection here. Speeding up, I think this is again about a reverse welfare magnet, so we can skip that one because we really don't have much time. Here we see a graph in which, in which we see a line which shows the relationship, but somehow all my graphs are a little bit distorted, but I hope you get a point. On the horizontal scale, it is welfare dependency, and on the vertical scale, we skip this one because it's too distorted too much. Next. Skip this one as well. I will end with the culture part, yes? So the next one, this is also, I think, hard to read. This is interesting. I don't know why, but still people are selling, they're selling immigration as a way to solve aging. And when you make this computation for the Netherlands and you pin the pension age at 70 years, because in the near future it will be 70 years, and you keep that the percentage of people over 70 at the same level with immigration, we have 18 million inhabitants now. By the end of this century, we will have 100 million inhabitants. By the end of the next century, it will be 1 billion inhabitants. So we will have a complete population explosion, and everybody in the end has to live in the Netherlands, or whatever country you choose. So we have to move on, I think. There's something, next one. We skip this one as well. And skip this one. Yeah, this is interesting. We have something called CITO. CITO is scholastic aptitude. It is for children of 11, 12 years old when they leave primary school to place them on the right level in our highly stratified school system. We have many levels in the Dutch school system. What we see here is huge gaps in this scholastic aptitude. This is based on the data of 2 million children, including 400,000 children with a first or second generation background. When we look at the second generation, this is first generation, second generation, we see a lot of improvement. So there's a lot of improvement. And when we can go back once and look, for example, at Turkey, East Africa, and Morocco, Turkey, East Africa, Morocco, and we go forth again, we see that Some countries like Turkey and Morocco, it stays red, while in East Africa it becomes green. There's a very important reason for that: mixed marriages. Mixed marriages are strongly correlated with the improvement from the first to the second generation. The more children have a Dutch-born or a native one parent of the second generation, the better the improvement of the scholastic aptitude scores. I think the next one. This is also important. This is a map of culture. It's from the World Values Survey. It's a long-lasting survey. It is started in the 80s, the early 80s, I believe, and it's been running for years. And in many countries, they ask numerous questions about culture, about how to raise children. What do you do when your daughter or your son comes home with somebody who is black or white or Jewish or Muslim or Christian, etc. It's about tolerance towards minorities. It's about many aspects of culture. And what we see here is that cultures differ a lot. It's not enough time to explain everything, but there's two axes here. The horizontal axis is about self-expression versus survival, and the vertical axis is about rational and secular values versus traditional values. And we in the Netherlands are in Protestant Europe. Next one, please. And the biggest distance you can travel on this map is, next slide, is to the African Islamic culture cluster. And next slide, please. When we look at the second generation, there's a 180,000 euro, let's say, integration gap between the average person from the Protestant Europe culture cluster and the average second generation background person from the African Islamic culture cluster. Second one. Oh, this is beyond recognition. I don't know, something went wrong. So I'll tell it in just ordinary plain English. What happens is when you look at this data set and you look at the cultural distance, it really correlates with everything. It correlates with things like net contribution, but also things like crime. Crime rates are strongly correlated with two things: educational level and cultural distance. Now, of course, it's difficult to say what cultural distance means in reality, because you might explain it with, well, cultural distance is related to discrimination and racism. The larger the cultural distance, the more willing Dutch people are to discriminate against people, as a way to explain it. There might be a lot of other explanations. Carl mentioned, for example, the tendency of women to participate in the labor force, which differs a lot between different groups. You also showed the graph with bars, with social housing, I believe. It's also related to this. But to make a very long story short, when you take this data set, the World Value Survey, or you take another data set, which is the Minkoff-Hofstede data set, and I'm working now with a third data set, which is still in the making, culture is strongly correlated with the integration of the second generation. There are two things which are really driving integration of the second generation. The first is educational level, and the second is cultural distance. And I think this is, because we are running out of time, I'm afraid. It's absolutely perfect. So it's a good way to end it with this really not understandable graph, but apologies for that. Thank you. We have no time for questions, I think, huh?
Perhaps at the end of the conference. Thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating. C'était vraiment passionnant. Merci beaucoup. C'est maintenant. I think it's your turn, Professor Coleman, dear David. Nous allons maintenant avoir grand honneur d'entendre le professeur David Coleman, qui est professeur émérite de démographie à l'Université d'Oxford. Would you like to be seated, David? It would be more convenient.
I'll stand until I fall over.
Okay, that's a bet to risk. David qui va prendre en quelque sorte le contre-pied du propos global de cette conférence, puisque pour lui, tout n'est pas économique, ça s'entend. Il y a donc beaucoup de choses à nous dire. David, the floor is yours. Just give me a sign when you want to switch to one slide. Thank you, David.
Thank you. Well, ladies and gentlemen, in what's been a very rich conference, we've had two particularly stunning papers in the last two presentations, which have made me very excited and agitated and make me feel that I want to get on and find out more about that rather than talk about my old stuff on this presentation. However, I have my duty to do, so let me proceed. First of all, I did produce a few slides concerning these economic issues and population, how population can compensate for population aging through immigration, but I will skip them all, unfortunately, except for the one which deals with. If you can flip through them quickly, I just want to just a bit so I can see, so I can read it. Yep, next one. Next one. Next one. No, I can't see it. One of my comments was that certain aspects of demographic change in America were to you coin a phrase, making America Hispanic again. And I wanted to ask my colleagues about that after this meeting. Can we flip back one? No, and again, and again, and again. And again, sorry, and again, and again, and again. No, sorry, forgive me. This is like driving a very bad car. one step on, please. Right. Well, essentially, this summarizes all I want to say. So I could walk away and leave you to have your drinks and coffee and things rather earlier. My point is that there are certain things that we have not spoken or thought very much about because they're difficult. In a more religious age, they would be described as things which are inter Christianus non nominanda. Because it wasn't respectable or safe, and to talk about them then as now would cause a great deal of uncomfortable shuffling in seats and looking at soles of shoes rather than facing the facts. Essentially, this is about population replacement and the long-term effects, good or ill, of large volumes of immigration combined with very low levels of fertility. And how we cope with this, what we think a society is going to be, which will arise out of these two complementary trends. If you can have the next one. One response to that kind of question, what kind of society are we heading for almost inexorably if current levels of fertility in the West and current levels of migration in the West are put together, is so what? And that was the blunt question asked by a senior British member of the cabinet in response to someone saying that at present rates that major cities in Britain would be entirely or mostly populated by people of Afro-Asian ethnic background. So what? It's a very good question because it is, I think, assumed by most people of my age anyway, and possibly a bit younger, that it wouldn't be a very good thing, although for rather ill-specified reasons. And Sajid Javid has put his finger on it by very bluntly asking that question, and it's up to someone to answer it, and to begin with, actually, to start discussing it. Because I think it's fair to say that in Britain, and perhaps in the rest of the Western world, it's not really talked about very much, if at all, for all kinds of reasons of difficulty and embarrassment. I think the role of embarrassment in formulating and preventing policy formation in many areas of our polity is considerably underestimated. However, that's a different story. So next, if you would. Yes, first of all, low fertility. Low fertility is a bad problem which is getting worse. It's particularly bad in the Far East. I think that's the next one, yes. Here is the eastern, the cluster of East Asian industrial economy heading, it would seem, for oblivion. And it's even worse than that, because the fertility rate in South Korea, which I've just come back from, is 0.72. And the fertility rate in Seoul, where about half the entire population live, is 0.55. Those of you who know something about demography will see what the implication of that is, and it is very grave, and the poor old Koreans are very worried about it. Various remedies are put forward, migration, pushing up the birth rate, both necessary, actually, but both difficult to do anything about. But they do not have, at the moment, very much migration, and this issue of ethnic replacement does not apply to them. Neither does it, well, can we have the next one? Oh yes, this is a doom graph, the most pessimistic graph ever published on an official website. It comes from the Japanese Institute of Social and Demographic Research, which is a government body, and it shows the consequences of the continuation of then current levels of migration, of fertility in Japan, given low levels of migration. As you can see, the edge structure falls but remains constant. That's the nature of demographic theory. But the population goes down and down and down. And eventually, the last Japanese has to turn the lights off in about 3000 AD. Not to be frustrated, the South Korean population beats them to it in 2750. Now, these are fantasy graphs, I think, but nonetheless they are the rigid implications of what's going on at the moment. Can I have the next one? Yes, these are. I can't quite read. I think these are similar graphs from Southern Europe, which are also a low fertility population. But Southern Europe is one where migration is very high and where replacement of the population is likely to be much more important and interesting. Next, please. The alternative is, of course, there are a whole batch of reasonably high fertility countries in the Anglosphere and Western Europe, where birth rates, not at a replacement level, although France almost does it, or has almost done it from time to time, are in the safe zone until recently of about 1.6, 1.7, where population aging can be compensated for by non-demographic adjustments. That's all very well, but those days, it seems, are over. And in the last decade or so, perhaps a bit less, we've seen a marked pitch downwards. Next one, please. In fertility, which is really causing great problems to my colleagues. All my colleagues are busy scratching their heads and muttering that they don't understand what's going on. And unfortunately, this is true. We don't know what's going on. One can put forward all sorts of reasons why birth rates are going down in Europe. Most interestingly, sir, least of all in France. France is often left out of this discussion. Everyone talks about how wonderful Nordic social welfare is in keeping the birth rate up. Well, France is different, and the French total fertility has declined from about 1.8, almost 1.9 to about 1.65, but it's still much higher than most countries in Europe. So many congratulations to the French government and the French public. Next, please. The next dimension is, of course, migration. This is just one example of a very high growth in migration. This is the United Kingdom itself, which we heard a great deal about in alarming detail in one of the previous talks. And this has consequences. If we can see the next one. This is the proportion of the population born outside the UK, and then we have the next one, the proportion of persons belonging to the ethnic minority populations. No, sorry, this is the total numbers. And you can see that the impact of policy, which has come out of the previous two talks, very well illustrated here, because you can see that it markedly turns upwards after the late 1990s, and we all know which political party came to power then, although they've since been outdone by the Conservative Party, contrary to what should have been the case, who put it up even higher. So, next, please. This is some work done by Lanzieri, who is employed by Eurostat, but it's not a Eurostat publication, who has shown what the proportion of people of so-called foreign background is in a number of countries in about 2001, I think, and 2061. And in some cases, it's now over a half in the case of Austria, projected for 2061. Very considerable variation, but all very substantial and always pointing in the same direction. Can we have the next one, please? This is a projection which I made and published in 2010, showing what the current rates implied for the ethnic composition of the United Kingdom, assuming that immigrant birth rates converged on the national average, or in some cases were lower. But the migration remained at the then level of 165,000 per year. It is, of course, now ever so slightly higher. And that showed the UK population of British origin going down to 50% by about 2066. That, of course, is an impossible precise figure because all population projections are always wrong. Nonetheless, that's what the calculations ended up with, and a number of other calculations, to my astonishment, have ended up with the same date through different routes. However, next, please. This is just an example of uncertainty. There are ways of doing projections which incorporate uncertainty, but even there, you've got to assume what the uncertainty is, so it doesn't really get around the problem of not knowing what the future holds for us. Next. Yes, here we are. Here's the United States. Now, I want to know what Americans think about this. There seems to be very little interest in it as far as I can gather. No agitation, not much concern. Perhaps Mr. Krikorian can tell us more about it later on. But this is an official projection by the US Bureau of the Census. The same body produces a whole series of projections on a regular basis. They all end up showing something like this, with the US white non-Hispanic population, so-called in bureaucratic terms, becoming a minority sometime around 2040 something, which is not very far in the future. As you can see, with the major component of growth, the green line being the Hispanic population, where it is mostly driven by migration, not by fertility differentials. Next, please. The same story can be seen in most, I think, all countries for which comparable data is available. Here is the Netherlands, proportion of foreign origin with and without migration. Next one, please. These are some projections for the four Nordic countries by Kirsti Tervonen, who is a Finnish academic, showing very much the same story. Next one, please. That's just the other way around. And this is just a few of them put together. The trend is always in the same direction. Nothing, as far as I know, has been reversed, except that the pace of change in the Netherlands and in Denmark appears to be considerably moderated. And perhaps people from that country might offer some explanation for that. Well, I think I know what the explanation is later on. Next, please. So, do governments pay any attention? Well, in Britain, no. I've never heard any government comment on this issue. We all would have thought that the fact that the population is visibly changing year from year, and that any rational projection leads to a considerable radical change in the composition of the population of the country over the lifetime of many people now living, would have attracted some interest and some discussion, but it is just a no-go area as far as I can see. There are a number of reasons for this. It is the guardians of righteousness as it were, are rather keen to try to suppress these awkward, embarrassing, potentially racist discussions in terms of the behavior of publishing houses, the behavior of some of the media, the behavior of the police, all conspiring together as British people in this, not conspiring, that's a silly word, all taking a similar line, a consensual line on the undesirability of raising these topics, not the least because with a genuine fear that it might raise up hostility and even violence against the minorities involved. So it's not entirely without reason, but nonetheless it has suppressed discussion of what some people may think is the most important topic facing the social structure of the country. Next, please. Oh, yeah, here it is. Yes, thank you. So, 1 minute. Why does it matter? Here are a few reasons why it might matter, and why people might rationally think this is not a very good route to be going down, most of which I sympathize with, but there are completely different opinions. Some feel it doesn't matter, some feel it's even beneficial to improve the variety and the inventiveness and the of the British population as a kind of harbinger of the globalization of people of different origins into something more homogeneous and less prone to strife. So there are good reasons for thinking that it might not matter or might be beneficial. But these different views don't exchange views because it's never discussed. Next, please. What might happen next? Well, it's rather interesting. What might happen next? No one, as far as I know, has set out any kind of realistic scenario as to what a society might look like, where within living memory, the Aboriginal population, if you can call it that, the indigenous population, the population of long settled status, has been replaced by newcomers from a variety of different parts of the world. I don't know of any social theory which will lead us to predict accurately what might happen. I don't think there'll be violence. Sometimes it's said we must stop this because there'll be violence on the streets. I don't think so. The British people, anyway, are a peaceful lot and have been, I think perhaps it's fair to say, somewhat cowed by race relations legislation, by the repeated instructions as to how to regard these changes from the elite, and by education in school and in colleges, and by the difficulty of publishing documents which have any bearing upon it. Would institutions and constitutions change? If we had a population with a very large proportion of people of still adhering to Islam in its traditional form, for example, then it may be that there'll be pressure of a purely democratic kind to change those institutions, certainly disestablish the Church of England, and make other differences to education, representation, and all the rest. There's also the broader question, Caldwell's question, can Europe be the same with different people in it? Or will it become just a geographical expression with a completely different set of people living in it, perfectly peacefully, than was the case before? And of course, it depends very much on the pace of integration and who's integrating to whom. The retreat of the majority population from major urban centres is already well in progress, with London being the most spectacular example, but it also applies to almost all other major urban centres. So there is a dispersal to suburban and rural areas already happening. Is it possible to get the bottom part of the slide up? No, never mind. Perhaps you can go back. I was perhaps frivolously suggesting that in the very, very long run, what the British population of white origin might face is a kind of hobbit future of obscurity in rural corners, still living out some vestiges of a previous life. Next, please. Oh, something has dropped off. there was a rather optimistic slide which we seem to have lost of glamorous people, because as our geneticist Dr. Steve Jones points out, the future is brown. People will not look what they looked like in the past, and I had three examples: one of Barack Obama, one of our champion racing driver Lewis Hamilton, and also the delectable Miss Albigeois, who unfortunately I can't show you, who has won the competition of Beauty Queen and was cruelly treated by the French government, and there must have been a hope somewhere that she might have sought refuge and asylum in Britain, where I'm sure she'd be very well received. And I'm sorry you can't see why, because the picture isn't there. That's not entirely a frivolous point, because it's not just colour that would change. It's also the kind of culture and the values which those people would have, possibly for the better. But it could not possibly remain the same when the population behind it has changed so much. And there I'll stop with apologies for going on too long.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you very much, David. I could use the words absolutely fascinating for the third time in a row, and that would be as sincere for the third time. Dernière intervention avant la conclusion de M. Brochant, celle de Michel Auboin, qui va nous parler de ce qui peut apparaître dans une certaine mesure comme une spécificité française. Il va nous expliquer pourquoi. C'est la question du logement social, avec une focale particulière sur les interactions entre cette politique du logement social et les questions liées à l'immigration. Michel, c'est à toi.
Merci beaucoup et merci surtout d'avoir organisé cette rencontre. Pendant 4 ans, j'ai exercé les fonctions de directeur de l'intégration des étrangers en France. Et j'avoue que si j'avais eu à l'époque la possibilité de voir ainsi mes collègues de tous les pays se pencher sur ces sujets aussi importants, j'aurais été très heureux. Ce n'était pas du tout le cas. Et c'était d'autant moins le cas qu'à la même époque, donc il y a quand même un peu plus de 10 ans, on avait assez peu de données, assez peu accès aux données et qu'on était chargé d'un sujet sur lequel, en fait, on avait une connaissance assez limitée. Est-ce que je parle trop vite ? Un peu, d'accord. Je vais raccourcir mon propos pour aller plus lentement. Lorsque j'étais directeur, on avait lancé une étude sur le logement des immigrés, et cette étude montrait une disparité dans le comportement des immigrés en fonction de leur origine, une disparité dans les accès au logement. Mais à l'époque, les données dont nous disposions, les données de l'INSEE, étaient trop générales d'une certaine façon, et il était impossible d'en tirer des conclusions intelligentes, si je puis dire. Depuis l'INSEE, pour nos amis étrangers, donc l'INSEE, c'est vous savez, l'organisme qui collecte les données statistiques en France, qui les collecte, mais qui ne les traite pas toujours. Et donc, c'est un peu le grand mystère de la statistique française. L'INSEE a affiné sa méthode, et donc en particulier sur les origines, moins loin que ce qu'on aimerait, parce qu'on aimerait évidemment aller encore beaucoup plus loin, mais ce n'est pas tout à fait le cas. Mais surtout, ce qui est intéressant, c'est que ces statistiques ne sont pas publiées, elles ne sont pas étudiées, enfin elles sont rendues disponibles, mais elles ne sont pas étudiées. Et donc j'ai eu le plaisir de retraiter, grâce à l'amitié de mes amis de l'OID, de retraiter ces données sur la question qui était posée, donc quel est le comportement des étrangers par rapport au logement, et de publier avec l'aide de la Fondapol au printemps dernier un petit fascicule qui s'appelle « Les étrangers extra-communautaires et le logement social ». Je dis extra-communautaire parce que tout le monde comprend qu'évidemment, la question aujourd'hui qui nous concerne le plus directement, c'est la question des étrangers en dehors de l'Union européenne, et même en dehors d'ailleurs, au-delà, puisqu'on a aussi beaucoup de ressortissants de Grande-Bretagne en France, évidemment, qui ne sont pas comptés comme des étrangers, autant au sens où on l'entend. Alors, ce qu'on comprend lorsqu'on analyse ces chiffres, c'est que ou plutôt pour comprendre l'analyse de ces chiffres, il faut partir d'une réalité qui est très franco-française, comme Nicolas l'a dit tout à l'heure, qui d'une certaine façon n'existe pas ailleurs dans l'espace européen, sauf si certains pays m'ont échappé, et qui est la situation de ce qu'on appelle, nous, le logement social public, qu'on appelle plus exactement le HLM dans le langage courant, qui est une forme de logement qui, d'une certaine façon, n'existe pas sous les mêmes formes ailleurs. C'est un logement qui dépend pour l'essentiel de l'État, hein, à travers différents organismes, mais qui dépend pour l'essentiel de l'État, qui a échappé aux collectivités locales et aux communes, alors que dans beaucoup de pays, c'est plutôt les communes qui sont chargées du logement social, et qui s'est bâti dans les années 1960, sous forme d'immeubles collectifs rassemblés dans des quartiers éloignés des centres-villes. Je ne reviens pas sur la démonstration, mais si vous avez des questions, je pourrais vous expliquer pourquoi nous avons choisi ce type de modèle. Et ce logement social public, aujourd'hui, est devenu une sorte de monstre administratif, si je puis dire, puisque on a 11 millions d'habitants en France qui vivent dans ces logements, dans 4,7 millions de logements gérés par 593 organismes, et avec un chiffre d'affaires, donc de loyers et de charges, de 26 milliards d'euros par an. Ça c'est la première partie, c'est le paysage général. Et en quoi ça nous concerne en matière d'immigration? C'est parce qu'évidemment, une grande partie des immigrés qui viennent en France accèdent à ces logements sociaux publics. Dans tous les pays du monde, évidemment, la question de la migration et du logement aboutit assez vite aboutit à cause des solidarités assez naturelles qui existent parmi ces migrants, à des formes de communautarisation, de communauté en tout cas, d'origine, et ça vous le voyez partout, et c'est assez naturel. Et notre modèle de logement social aurait dû s'opposer à ce type de communautarisation, puisque le modèle de la France, vous savez, c'est plutôt le modèle fondé sur cette idée du service public qui est la nôtre, c'est-à-dire de l'égalité de tous devant le service public, et donc en fait de la mixité sociale. Et même si ces logements sont gérés par les institutions publiques, le résultat, au bout du compte, finit par être le même que dans les autres pays, c'est-à-dire que petit à petit, ces quartiers deviennent de plus en plus des quartiers de communautés d'origine étrangère. Alors dans ces communautés, c'est ça qui est intéressant à travers notre étude, c'est qu'en fait chaque communauté a un comportement très différent vis-à-vis du logement, au regard de simplement deux critères, la demande d'accès au logement social ou l'accès à la propriété privée. Dans la conception française originelle, le logement social est un logement provisoire qui permet ensuite d'accéder au logement par la propriété à travers un processus qu'on appelle le parcours résidentiel. Ce mécanisme a en grande partie disparu. Aujourd'hui, nous avons des locataires de logements HLM qui restent toute leur vie et qui parfois, par un mécanisme qui normalement n'est pas dans la loi mais qui existe quand même, transmettent leur logement à leurs enfants et puis pour certains même à leurs petits-enfants. Donc on a une partie de la population résidente en HLM qui va rester très longtemps en HLM, et par ailleurs le mécanisme d'accès à la propriété qui a été le mécanisme qui a été utilisé pour permettre l'accès au logement des Français, celui-ci est en train de se gripper, si je puis dire, puisque le nombre de propriétaires en France est plutôt... Alors c'est toujours difficile de comparer avec d'autres pays, mais il est en tout état de cause par rapport aux autres pays européens, plutôt en bas de la moyenne. 61% simplement des Français sont propriétaires de leur logement, ce qui n'est pas beaucoup, hein, ce qui est très peu par rapport à beaucoup d'autres, et qui ne correspond pas du tout à l'image qu'on pouvait s'en faire d'ailleurs d'un parcours résidentiel qui allait amener les Français tous vers le logement individuel. Alors, quand on regarde la répartition maintenant des communautés, et c'est ça qui est intéressant, en fonction des données que nous donne l'INSEE, qui fait quand même des grandes catégories, on peut dire que les étrangers qui arrivent et demandent et obtiennent un logement en secteur HLM se répartissent en 4 catégories. Une première catégorie qui sont les ressortissants venus d'Algérie, une deuxième catégorie qui sont les ressortissants venus du Maroc, une troisième catégorie qui sont les ressortissants venus d'Afrique subsaharienne, Mali en particulier, et puis une quatrième catégorie qui sont les ressortissants en provenance de l'Afrique centrale et guinéenne. République démocratique du Congo, par exemple. Et évidemment, ça ne fait pas la totalité des migrants qui arrivent. Alors, les migrants qui viennent d'Europe, traditionnellement, la dernière grande migration européenne en France, c'est l'émigration portugaise. Les Portugais n'accèdent jamais, dans leur histoire, n'ont jamais accédé au logement HLM, ou très peu. Les migrants qui viennent d'Asie, qui sont nombreux aussi, je pense à la migration chinoise, qui est importante en France, n'accèdent jamais au logement HLM et même sont plus propriétaires que les Français d'origine française. Pardon, quand je dis français, c'est Français d'origine française dans les statistiques. Voilà. Donc, c'est déjà intéressant de voir pourquoi certains demandent des logements sociaux et d'autres préfèrent choisir une modalité d'accès à la propriété privée. Et peut-être qu'au milieu du spectre, il y a les populations turques qui sont dans le logement social, y restent très peu et préfèrent acheter, sous forme de maisons collectives d'ailleurs surtout, des habitations privées. Ce mécanisme-là, il différencie en fait ces 4 groupes de façon un peu distincte. On a évidemment les 2 groupes de l'Afrique subsaharienne et de l'Afrique centrale qui sont très demandeurs de logements sociaux parce que c'est une immigration récente et donc c'est une immigration plus pauvre que les autres migrations. Ils sont très demandeurs de logements sociaux. Ils sont très demandeurs de logements sociaux aussi parce qu'ils ont une excellente image du logement collectif. Habiter en immeuble, c'est valorisant. Donc, et puis, ils accèdent facilement au logement social parce qu'ils remplissent toutes les conditions d'accès au logement social, c'est-à-dire des familles avec beaucoup d'enfants, enfin avec de nombreux enfants. Et parmi eux, on a une population très particulière qui sont les familles monoparentales, femmes seules, avec plusieurs enfants, qui sont très typiques, par exemple, des populations maliennes. Ça ne veut pas dire qu'il n'y a pas de père quelque part, mais le père est inconnu, et donc on ne sait pas où il est, et donc la femme se présente comme étant seule avec des enfants. Elle est toujours prioritaire dans l'accès au logement. C'est un biais qui fait que ces familles-là obtiennent des logements, souvent assez vite lorsqu'elles arrivent en France, et créent une tension sur le marché du logement, parce que le logement, malgré sa taille et son ampleur, le logement social public français connaît une offre qui est nettement inférieure à la demande, puisqu'aujourd'hui, nous avons plus de 2 millions de personnes qui souhaitent habiter en logement social et qui n'obtiennent pas un logement social, et que sur la seule région parisienne, il faut en moyenne 11 ans pour obtenir un logement social. On peut revenir aussi dessus pour expliquer pourquoi cette inertie considérable du logement social à la française, qui a obligé les gouvernements successifs d'ailleurs à édicter des lois qui obligent les communes à construire, les communes qui ne sont pas responsables du logement social, mais qui les obligent quand même à construire sur leur commune 25% de logements sociaux et à augmenter d'ailleurs dans une perspective un peu étrange qui voudrait que, à terme, un quart et sans doute plus des Français soient, je mets des guillemets, condamnés à vivre en HLM, puisqu'en fait, derrière ce modèle de logement public social à la française, on a la notion d'immeuble collectif. C'est une vision collectiviste qui nous sépare d'ailleurs complètement de nos amis anglais, une vision collectiviste du logement social qui fait que le logement social, c'est forcément un immeuble, c'est forcément des immeubles dans des quartiers et c'est forcément éloigné des centres-villes pour une raison économique qui est le coût du foncier. Hein, donc c'est assez facile à comprendre. Alors donc les familles africaines sont très demandeuses de logement social, avec une différence entre les subsahariens et puis l'Afrique centrale. Et quand je prends les populations maghrébines, là, c'est pas du tout la même question, c'est la question de la pérennité dans le logement social. Et alors là, les Algériens et les Marocains se distinguent assez nettement. La population algérienne reste en logement social. Et la population algérienne, je rappelle pour ceux qui connaissent mal l'histoire de France, elle arrive en 1968. L'ancien ambassadeur de France en Algérie a beaucoup travaillé sur le sujet. Elle arrive en 1968 à travers un accord. En fait, elle est déjà là auparavant. Ces logements étaient des logements qui avaient été construits pour une population française mal logée, qui se sont vidés petit à petit dans le cadre du processus que j'ai expliqué tout à l'heure d'accès à la propriété privée. Ces logements vides accueillent en 1962, lors de l'indépendance de l'Algérie, une population venue d'Algérie qui est une population française et juive d'Algérie. Et puis à partir de 1968, elle accueille une population algérienne, une sorte de paradoxe qui n'existe que dans l'histoire de France, qui fait que le pays qui, à bon droit, nous avait chassés, en fait, nous envoie ensuite ses propres habitants pour venir occuper les logements qui avaient été occupés auparavant par ceux qui avaient été chassés par ceux qui ont aidé au remplacement des Algériens. Cette population algérienne, elle reste dans le logement, et c'est ça qui est assez, qui moi personnellement m'a surpris à travers la lecture de cette étude, la mienne, c'est cette population reste dans le logement social sur plusieurs générations. Pour une raison qui s'explique sans doute par la difficulté à choisir entre habiter en France ou habiter en Algérie. En gros, une partie, le logement social permet de dégager pour les habitants, pour les locataires, permet de dégager une sorte de gain qui se calcule entre le prix du loyer net, parce qu'il y a des allocations, le prix du loyer net et puis le revenu net. Le prix du loyer net est évidemment très inférieur au prix du loyer net dans le logement privé, hein, tout le monde le comprend. Et ce gain-là, qui était calculé, hein, qui peut aller jusqu'à 10 000 € par an, ce gain-là permet de financer non pas une construction en France, mais une construction en Algérie. Ce qui est parfaitement compréhensible pour la première génération. Hein, on l'a connu à travers l'exode rural. Je prends souvent cet exemple de la famille bretonne venue s'installer à Paris, mais qui a gardé quand même une maison en Bretagne. Donc cette logique est parfaitement compréhensible à la première génération. La deuxième génération, elle est française. La troisième génération, elle est française d'origine française. Mais donc le fait qu'on ait encore des réticences à s'installer dans la propriété, puisque l'accès au logement social et l'accès à la propriété, c'est très corrélé dans les statistiques, cette difficulté à s'installer pose un problème dont on pourrait parler. La population marocaine, par rapport à la population algérienne, a un comportement moins tranché. Et donc, la population marocaine qui est dans la même situation, c'est-à-dire le Maroc, c'est pas plus loin que l'Algérie, on peut aussi avoir une résidence là-bas, c'est moins tranché, donc les Marocains sont plus propriétaires et restent moins longtemps dans le logement social. Le logement social à la française, donc c'est un ensemble qui est très important, comme je vous l'ai dit tout à l'heure, mais qui surtout nous pose un problème très particulier, qui sont les quartiers les plus concentrés, à la fois en surface et à la fois en habitants. En surface, c'est en gros des quartiers qui font moins de 50 hectares, et en habitants, c'est des quartiers qui font entre 10 000 et 20 000 personnes. Ces quartiers, tous les Français connaissent, parce qu'il suffit d'ouvrir le journal tous les jours, de regarder la télévision pour trouver un nom de quartier, parce que c'est dans ces quartiers-là que la France connaît les plus grands désordres. d'un point de vue administratif, on les classe sous une appellation un peu étrange qui s'appelle les quartiers de la politique de la ville. Je dis un peu étrange parce que la politique de la ville, on en parle beaucoup, elle nous coûte cher, mais en même temps, on ne sait pas très bien quel est son objet. Et d'ailleurs, les gouvernements successifs ne l'ont pas dit non plus. Donc on finance, c'est l'une des seules politiques qu'on mène en France, on finance une politique pour un objet qui n'a jamais été défini, mais qui, toute évidence, a quelque chose à voir avec les désordres ou l'insécurité qui y règnent. Parce que si on n'avait pas eu les premières émeutes en 1981, on n'aurait pas créé la première politique de la ville. Si on n'avait pas eu d'émeutes en 2005, on n'aurait pas renforcé la politique de la ville. Et si on n'avait pas eu l'an dernier des émeutes en 2023 qui nous ont coûté 1 milliard d'euros, on n'aurait pas non plus poursuivi la politique de la ville. Ces quartiers de politique de la ville, ce qui est intéressant, c'est, mais je n'aurai pas le temps de faire ce qui est intéressant, c'est qu'en concentrant les populations dont je parlais tout à l'heure, et en particulier les populations immigrées d'origine africaine, elles concentrent toute une série de difficultés. Et je vais juste finir sur l'aspect chiffré pour que je rate pas l'objet d'aujourd'hui, parce que je n'étais pas là pour parler de sociologie, mais du coup, donc c'est QPV, quartier politique de la ville, QPV, 30% de l'ensemble des logements sociaux, qui logent environ entre 5 et 8 millions de locataires en France, coûtent 30% évidemment de l'ensemble du coût du logement social. Le coût du logement social en France, c'est 40 milliards d'euros à peu près. Mais les QPV eux-mêmes génèrent des surcoûts liés à la rénovation urbaine des bâtiments, qui est portée par l'État, 2,5 milliards par an. La politique de la ville dont je parlais tout à l'heure, monsieur le député, 600 millions d'euros par an. Les transferts de dotation entre collectivités à travers la DSU, 2,4 milliards d'euros par an. Et le coût des émeutes et des désordres, 1 milliard en 2023, et aussi un coût non chiffré, mais qui est important, lié au désordre et au crime, et en particulier et de plus en plus au trafic de drogue, un surcoût lié à la sécurité, aux assurances, aux réparations, et peut-être aussi, même si personne n'en parle, un manque à gagner important pour le budget d'État, mais on n'est pas les seuls, nos amis des Pays-Bas connaissent ça comme moi, qui est justement ce fameux trafic de drogue, et en particulier de cocaïne, qui génère, selon les études un peu sérieuses, près de 6 milliards d'euros par an de revenus pour leurs organisateurs. 6 milliards d'euros, c'est le chiffre d'affaires de l'exportation du champagne en France. Sur ces 6 milliards d'euros, les industriels de la cocaïne ne payent ni charges sociales, ni impôts locaux, ni autres impôts. S'ils ne payaient que 50% de leur chiffre d'affaires en impôts comme tout le monde, on aurait 3 milliards de plus à mettre dans notre caisse pour financer une partie de la politique de la ville, et ça serait très utile. Voilà, je m'arrête. Merci.
Merci beaucoup Michel, et pour plus de détails sur ce sujet, je vous renvoie effectivement à l'étude que Michel Auboin a signée pour l'Observatoire de l'immigration et la Fondapol au printemps dernier, qui est disponible gratuitement en ligne. Nous allons passer à la conclusion avec quelqu'un qui a la particularité d'avoir un lien personnel avec la plupart des pays des intervenants ici présents, c'est-à-dire que, vous me corrigerez Monsieur le Président, mais je crois que vous avez été ambassadeur en Israël et en Hongrie. Vous avez vécu aux États-Unis à plusieurs reprises, et vous avez notamment été représentant permanent adjoint de la France aux Nations Unies à New York, mais vous connaissez aussi le reste du pays. Je crois que vous êtes lié familialement à la Grande-Bretagne. Je ne sais pas si vous avez un lien particulier avec les Pays-Bas, auquel cas ça viendra, c'est ça. En tout cas, ce sera la seule exception. Et par ailleurs, vous avez été directeur général de la DGSE pendant 6 ans. Pour nos amis étrangers, la DGSE, ce sont les services d'intelligence extérieure de la France. Et j'ai le grand honneur de vous laisser conclure, Monsieur le Président.
Bonsoir. Bonsoir, mesdames, messieurs. Bonsoir, monsieur le député. Merci de votre hospitalité. Grand bonsoir aussi à madame Tribala, à laquelle nous devons beaucoup et sans laquelle nous ne serions peut-être pas là. En tant que président de l'Observatoire de l'immigration et de la démographie, il me revient donc l'honneur, mais surtout le devoir, de finir cette réunion. Comme on vous l'a dit, je ne suis pas technicien de l'immigration ni de la démographie. Donc la nature de mon exposé sera un peu différente. En particulier, je ne vais pas essayer de résumer en quelques phrases ce qui s'est dit ce soir, j'en serais bien incapable. Je vais plutôt tenter, dans les quelques minutes qui me sont imparties, de donner une réponse personnelle, je le précise, à une question simple mais centrale. Pourquoi sommes-nous ici ? Qu'est-ce qui, à mes yeux, nous rassemble au sein de ce réseau de recherche sur l'immigration ? Bref, une forme de profession de foi. Je m'en tiendrai à quelques points de repère et dont le choix sera forcément influencé par le contexte français et celui de l'OID. Premier point. Il est évident que nous tous ici n'avons pas la même histoire ni la même géographie. Nos traditions juridiques ne sont pas identiques. La couleur politique de nos gouvernements est variable. Nous différons dans nos approches légales sur les critères d'ascendance, ce qui est très important, la nationalité ou et l'ethnie. Le fédéralisme n'est pas le centralisme. Certains font partie de l'Union européenne, d'autres non, etc., etc. En revanche, nous partageons deux caractères originaux qui, à mon sens, nous distinguent du reste du monde. D'une part, nos pays peuvent être qualifiés de démocratie avancée, pour ce que cela veut dire. D'autre part, mais sans nul doute, il y a un lien de cause à effet, le revenu par tête est chez nous nettement plus élevé qu'ailleurs. Deux caractères qui, au fond, définissent aujourd'hui sur un plan très concret ce qu'est l'Occident par rapport à ce que l'on appelle désormais d'un nom curieux, le Sud global. Deuxième point, de cette situation commune découlent des problèmes communs. L'un des plus cruciaux, sinon le plus crucial, c'est l'immigration. Depuis des décennies, en effet, nos territoires reçoivent des flux de population jamais vus auparavant. Nos amis hongrois ne sont certes pas encore complètement affectés, mais s'ils sont ici, c'est parce qu'ils redoutent de l'être un jour, et je les comprends fort bien. Le fait capital sur lequel on saurait trop insister, c'est que ces mouvements n'ont rien à voir, mais rien à voir avec tous ceux qui les ont précédés. Par conséquent, s'efforcer de les inscrire à tout prix dans une continuité naturelle aboutit à se méprire grandement à leur sujet. C'est pourquoi notre souci, à l'OID et à moi-même, n'est pas tellement celui de l'immigration en soi. Car de ce point de vue, nous reconnaissons aisément que l'admission limitée de personnes nées ailleurs est non seulement incontournable, mais souhaitable sous certaines conditions. Non. Ce qui nous préoccupe avant tout, c'est ce qui se passe hic et nunc, chez nous et maintenant. C'est-à-dire des entrées massives, irrégulières pour une part notable, sans logique économique cohérente, de populations extra-occidentales, majoritairement peu éduquées, liées par des affinités communautaires obligées, et pour ce qui est de l'Europe, à forte proportion musulmane. D'où une distance culturelle, au sens large, qui incline les nouveaux arrivants à se regrouper en isolats, qui à leur tour fournissent des structures d'accueil à d'autres arrivants de même profil. En outre, chez ceux déjà installés, une démographie dynamique et une forte tendance à l'endogamie favorisent une croissance mécanique du nombre en boule de neige. Dernière singularité, alors proprement extraordinaire celle-ci, tient à ce que, contrairement aux attentes, une fraction significative des deuxième et troisième générations s'éloigne des valeurs du pays hôte, ces valeurs mêmes au nom desquelles leurs parents y ont été admis. Troisième point, un bouleversement d'une telle ampleur historique amène à s'interroger infatigablement sur ses causes. Du côté des départs, le but est limpide. Il s'agit d'accroître instantanément le niveau de vie en franchissant une frontière à travers soit le travail, soit l'accès immédiat à un système de protection sociale très évolué, soit l'hospitalité des précurseurs déjà sur place. De notre côté, c'est plus compliqué. Interviennent certes aussi des intérêts économiques, sur lesquels je reviendrai, mais le facteur décisif me paraît d'ordre idéologique. Sans trop m'appesantir sur ce thème, parce que ce n'est pas celui de notre soirée, je formulerai l'hypothèse selon laquelle, vers la fin du siècle dernier, l'Occident, fidèle à son projet d'émancipation du genre humain, a franchi une nouvelle étape en donnant la priorité absolue à l'autodétermination des individus, c'est-à-dire aux droits de l'homme, par rapport à l'autodétermination des peuples, c'est-à-dire leur souveraineté. Dès lors, l'accès à notre sol n'a plus été régi, comme autrefois, par des lois exprimant des décisions politiques nationales, mais par la jurisprudence de cours constitutionnels interprétant hors de tout contrôle des principes abstraits, arbitrairement décrétés universels, axés sur la protection des individus, quels qu'ils soient, d'où qu'ils viennent. D'où l'abolition progressive et extravagante des disparités juridiques entre nationaux et étrangers, entre étrangers réguliers et irréguliers, et même entre irréguliers et demandeurs d'asile. Tous désormais plus ou moins confondus dans la même entreprise humaniste et humanitaire de délégitimation des frontières. À quoi s'ajoute, dans la même ligne philanthropique, ce n'est pas le cas pour les États-Unis, mais pour l'Europe, un sentiment de culpabilité et un devoir de compensation vis-à-vis d'anciens colonisés qui nous incitent à leur témoigner une générosité unilatérale. Et alors, dans le cas privilégié de l'Union européenne, cette évolution s'est vue amplifiée et accélérée par une superstructure se voulant précisément la préfiguration d'un monde pacifié où les États s'effaceraient pour laisser la place à une société civile planétaire dont les accords de Schengen seraient le premier jalon. Quatrième point. Il s'ensuit que depuis un demi-siècle, les déplacements humains faisant route vers nous bénéficient d'une formidable stimulation intellectuelle et morale de notre part, au point que nos soi-disant politiques d'immigration ne sont plus en fait que des non-politiques, se contentant d'entériner le cours des choses au lieu de le maîtriser ou a fortiori de s'y opposer. Soit une sorte de désarmement unilatéral fondé sur un wishful thinking dont nous avons cru bien à tort qu'il était embrassé par le reste du monde. Encore plus grave, ce conformisme doctrinal, propagé en continu par la sphère médiatique et des ONG militantes à large audience, s'est aussi étendu à l'université et aux think tanks, fâcheusement transformés en lieu de fabrication en chaîne de la pensée organique, à rebours de leur vocation scientifique. D'où un cinquième point. Je vous le dirai tout net, cet état de choses ne nous convient pas. Mais alors, pas du tout. Car après 50 ans, nous constatons, si j'ose dire intuitivement, que la présente immigration n'est plus assimilable en raison de son nombre et qu'elle n'est que très partiellement intégrable en raison de sa nature. Or, il y a un élément aussi récent qu'important. Cette appréciation se voit de plus en plus partagé par les opinions publiques, que l'empirisme de la vie quotidienne conduit à revisiter le discours dominant. Mutation qui, à son tour, entraîne par le biais naturel du vote, non seulement l'ouverture d'un grand débat, mais aussi un début de redistribution dans le champ politique dont nous voyons la trace dans divers pays de part et d'autre de l'Atlantique. Sixièmement, donc, la période est critique. D'une part, l'unanimisme obligatoire se fissure, au point que l'immigration devient un enjeu électoral majeur dans nos démocraties, mais d'autre part, sa perpétuation à un rythme fou suscite des effets cumulatifs de plus en plus irréversibles qui imposent l'urgence d'une remise à plat. C'est pourquoi nous estimons à l'OID qu'il est de notre devoir civique d'intervenir dans cette grande disputation, mais d'une manière qui nous est propre. Ainsi, nous refusons le terrain des polémiques irrationnelles et des passions débridées. De même, l'affaire est trop grave pour nous satisfaire d'assertions qui ne seraient pas étayées par la rigueur et la probité. Ode sapere, ose savoir. Tel est le précepte dont Kant a fait la devise des Lumières et que nous reprenons à notre compte. C'est dans ce sillage de la connaissance comme valeur suprême que nous nous engageons. Loin de nous l'intention de combattre une idéologie par une autre. A fortiori, entendons-nous demeurer, vous l'avez dit, indépendants de tout parti politique ou gouvernement en place. Ce à quoi nous aspirons, c'est de nous en tenir aux faits mesurables, ou si l'on préfère, à la réalité qui parle d'elle-même. À cette fin, nous nous bornons à analyser des données dont les conditions de recueil sont inattaquables, puisque provenant quasi entièrement d'institutions publiques, bien sûr au-dessus de tout soupçon. Ces données, nous les traitons grâce aux méthodes objectives de la statistique afin d'en tirer des enseignements qui ne souffrent pas davantage de la contestation. Ainsi, nous avons pu exposer d'ores et déjà au grand jour des situations, des évolutions qui remettent profondément en question le bien fondé des croyances quasi-religieuses que j'évoquais à l'instant. Par ailleurs et surtout, nous diffusons le plus largement possible ces résultats en visant principalement les décideurs et faiseurs d'opinion, ainsi que les médias bien forcés de prendre en compte le sérieux de notre démarche, quoi qu'il leur en coûte. Quand nous le jugeons nécessaire ou indispensable, nous allons plus loin, d'une part en élaborant des productions entièrement originales, d'autre part en offrant des prescriptions clés en main. Bref, nous jouons un rôle que personne ne jouait jusqu'ici, en alimentant un contre-feu permanent, raisonné, raisonnable, à la vaste entreprise de désinformation dont nous sommes la cible depuis un demi-siècle. Nous butons cependant sur une petite difficulté, et ça sera mon 7e et dernier point. Autant avons-nous le sentiment de réussir à démontrer combien l'immigration non contrôlée provoque des altérations profondes dans la plupart des domaines de notre société, la démographie, la sécurité, la criminalité, la pratique religieuse, le séparatisme social, l'éducation, l'État-providence, plus généralement les services publics, etc. Autant constatons-nous que dans le registre strictement économique, les choses méritent d'être davantage creusées. Et c'est d'ailleurs pourquoi nous avons choisi d'organiser notre premier colloque sur ce thème. En effet, dans la sphère de la production et des échanges, nous nous heurtons, certes, là aussi, à une forme de catéchisme. En l'occurrence, la libre circulation des facteurs de production serait l'universel panacée, mais nous rencontrons, et c'est plus grave, des intérêts bien précis. Ces intérêts sont ceux, non négligeables, des secteurs employant des immigrés, souvent clandestins, pour des niveaux de rémunération rabaissés. Et qui dit intérêt dit naturellement ébauche d'argumentaire. Ainsi, on nous rappelle que la plupart de nos sociétés affichent un fort déclin démographique et que ce déclin rendrait indispensable l'injection continue de jeunes travailleurs extérieurs pour pérenniser ne serait-ce que le financement de l'État social. Par ailleurs, on nous signale amicalement qu'il y aurait des métiers que les natifs rechigneraient à exercer en raison de leur pénibilité et de la médiocrité des émoluments. Ces allégations sont discutables, et nous les discutons, mais elles ne sont pas absurdes. Car, d'autre part, et là nous en arrivons à une forme de paradoxe, nous avons de notre côté beaucoup travaillé et mis en lumière les nombreuses retombées économiques négatives, celles-ci, d'une immigration en roue libre. Taux d'activité très inférieur et taux de chômage très supérieur à la moyenne nationale, faible qualification professionnelle, productivité déficiente, pression à la baisse des salaires, multiplication de petits métiers à valeur ajoutée quasi nulle sur le modèle du tiers-monde, frein à la modernisation, surconsommation de prestations sociales et de services publics, sous-contribution à leur financement. Il y a donc là une contradiction. Pour en sortir, nous nous sommes assignés à l'OID 2 finalités. En premier lieu, obtenir une évaluation aussi juste et exhaustive que possible du coût net global de l'immigration pour la nation. Exercice complexe, comme on l'a vu, mais pas impossible. Les Pays-Bas nous en montrent la voie. Mais exercice aussi, surtout, indispensable pour couper, une fois pour toutes, les ailes du canard, selon lesquelles l'immigration serait à la fois une chance et une fatalité. Et en second lieu, nous allons réfléchir sur les conditions exigeantes en fonction desquelles une immigration économique légale et restreinte pourrait répondre à des besoins réels. J'en terminerai là. Je crois y avoir suffisamment insisté. Nous ne sommes pas des fanatiques de l'immigration zéro, ni des xénophobes de naissance. Moi-même, j'ai consacré l'intégralité de ma vie professionnelle à ausculter l'étranger sous tous ses angles, formes et latitudes. Au final, ce que nous sommes, ce sont des gens posés et pondérés qui, après mûre observation et réflexion, sont parvenus à des conclusions solidement établies. À savoir qu'au stade où nous en sommes arrivés, nous estimons impérieuse et urgente, monsieur le député, une reprise en main politique et drastique, quantitative et qualitative, des flux migratoires, sous peine de voir nos pays devenir ce que nous ne souhaitons pas qu'ils deviennent. C'est-à-dire des pays, je peux le prédire sur la base de mon expérience, encore une fois, des pays où des écarts culturels insoutenables provoqueraient un effondrement de la confiance sociale qui, à son tour, déclencherait l'écroulement de la qualité de l'existence au sens le plus large de cette expression. Et, je n'en dirai pas plus, en attendant, pire. Face à ces perspectives aussi inéluctables qu'inacceptables, le seul levier d'action dont nous disposons sont ceux que nous offre la démocratie. Le premier d'entre eux, préalable à tous les autres, c'est l'information des citoyens. Soit les éclairer afin de les aider à voir ce qu'ils voient, pour reprendre une situation de l'écrivain français Charles Péguy qui est devenu presque un lieu commun. Alors même qu'une orthodoxie pesante, déconnectée du factuel, les incite en permanence au contraire, c'est-à-dire ne pas voir ce qu'ils voient. Au-delà, c'est évidemment à eux, ces citoyens, que revient le dernier mot dans l'espace politique que leur ouvrent toutes les formes de scrutin. En toute simplicité, on pourrait appeler cela la volonté souveraine du peuple. Ce peuple, là je parle un peu pour le nôtre, le peuple français, puisse-t-il enfin s'exprimer clairement sur une question qui, au premier chef, engage son avenir, et je le pense sans détour, sa survie. Merci de m'avoir écouté.